No one wanted her. That was the truth Evelyn Moore faced as she stood alone on that Wyoming platform, watching the last lantern disappear into the pines. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who never came. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that a 6-year-old girl with ink-stained fingers had written those letters, forged her father's name, and chosen Evelyn to fill the emptiness in their broken home. This is the story of the bride no one claimed, the child brave enough to rewrite her own fate, and the family built not by blood, but by choice. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the autumn air like a knife through silk, sharp and final. Evelyn Moore pressed her gloved hand against the cold window, watching as the endless prairie gave way to clusters of pine trees, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun. Her heart hammered beneath her gray traveling dress, a rhythm of hope and terror that had accompanied her for 7 days across the American frontier. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and until 3 months ago had been teaching at Miss Pritchard's School for Young Ladies in Philadelphia. Now she was traveling to Pine Hollow, Wyoming territory, to marry a man she'd never met. A man named Caleb Grant, whose letters had been sparse but steady, whose words had painted pictures of a simple life in a growing settlement where a schoolteacher's skills would be valued and a carpenter's hands could build a future. The train lurched, metal screaming against metal, and began to slow. Evelyn's fingers found the edge of the envelope in her pocket. The last letter, the one that had confirmed the date of her arrival. She didn't need to read it again. She'd memorized every line during the sleepless nights in stuffy railway cars, repeating them like prayers. Miss Moore, your decision brings light to a house that has known too much darkness. Arrive on the 15th of October. I will be waiting. The 15th had come. She smoothed her skirts, adjusted the cameo at her throat, her mother's, the only thing of value she still owned, and lifted her chin. Whatever waited in Pine Hollow, she would face it with dignity. She'd made her choice, and Evelyn Moore did not turn back. The platform appeared outside her window, rough-hewn planks weathered silver by wind and time. A handful of buildings clustered beyond it, their paint fading, their windows reflecting the copper light of approaching dusk. Pine Hollow was smaller than she'd imagined, quieter, the kind of place where a stranger's arrival would be noticed by everyone. She rose as the train shuddered to a stop, gathering her carpet bag and the leather case that held her books, the few treasures she couldn't leave behind. Around her, other passengers moved with practiced efficiency, but Evelyn forced herself to move slowly, to breathe deeply, to calm the trembling in her hands. He will be there, he promised. The conductor, a weathered man with kind eyes, helped her down the narrow steps. Her boots touched the platform, and the reality of it struck her with unexpected force. This was Wyoming. This was the frontier. This was her future. "Good luck, miss," the conductor said, tipping his cap. There was something in his voice, pity, perhaps, or warning, that made her look at him sharply. But he'd already turned away, moving down the platform to help an elderly woman with her parcels. Evelyn set down her bags and scanned the platform. A young couple stood near the station house, embracing. A man in a dusty coat collected a crate of supplies. 2 children chased each other around a post, their laughter bright against the settling quiet. But no one approached her. No one called her name. Minutes passed. The other passengers dispersed, claimed by family or purpose, swallowed by the town beyond the tracks. The sun dipped lower, painting the pines a deep crimson. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands folded over her bag, her expression carefully composed. Perhaps he's been delayed. Perhaps there was business in town that couldn't wait. The station master emerged from the small building, a portly man with suspenders straining over his belly. He glanced at her, looked away, then looked back with obvious reluctance. "You waiting on someone, miss?" "Yes." Her voice was steady, proud. "Mr. Caleb Grant. He was to meet me here." The station master's face shifted, surprise, then something darker. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. "Caleb Grant, you say?" "Yes, I'm Evelyn Moore. I've come from Philadelphia to—" She paused, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cooling air. "We have an arrangement." "An arrangement." He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them, finding them strange. He removed his cap, scratched his graying hair, replaced it. Miss Moore, Caleb Grant doesn't come into town much. Keeps to himself out at his place. I'm aware he values his privacy, but he knew I was arriving today. He sent confirmation. The station master shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Behind him, the station house door opened, and a woman peered out, sharp-eyed, curious. She whispered something to someone inside, and suddenly Evelyn felt the weight of invisible eyes, the town's attention settling on her like dust. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding, the station master offered, his tone suggesting he believed no such thing. The Grant place is about 3 miles north, up past Miller's Creek. Not an easy walk, especially near dark. Then perhaps someone could give me directions or arrange transport. Well now, I suppose someone could, but... He glanced back at the station house, at the woman still watching. Maybe you ought to wait until morning. Mrs. Brennan runs a boarding house just up the street. Clean rooms, fair prices. Evelyn heard what he didn't say. Wait until morning because Caleb Grant isn't coming. Wait until morning because everyone here knows something you don't. Thank you, she said, her voice frost over steel. But I prefer to settle matters tonight. If Mr. Grant has been unavoidably detained, I'm certain he'll arrive shortly. The station master opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head slightly. Suit yourself, miss. I'll be locking up the station in an hour, but you're welcome to the bench until then. He retreated into the station house, leaving Evelyn alone on the platform as the shadows deepened and the temperature dropped. She moved to the bench he'd indicated, a simple wooden affair with no back, facing the tracks rather than the town, and sat down carefully, arranging her skirts, keeping her spine straight. He will come. But the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour stretched toward 2. The station master locked his doors and left without another word, though his glance was heavy with pity. Other townspeople passed, a shopkeeper closing his store, a woman herding children home, a rancher on horseback who slowed to stare before riding on. Evelyn met each gaze steadily, refusing to look away first, refusing to show the fear that was beginning to curl cold fingers around her heart. The sun set. Stars emerged, sharp and cold in the crystalline sky. Evelyn's fingers had gone numb despite her gloves. Her traveling dress, adequate for Philadelphia's autumn, proved woefully insufficient for Wyoming's evening chill. Still, she sat, her bags at her feet, her pride the only thing keeping her upright. A door opened across the street. A saloon, by the sound of it, voices and piano music spilling into the night. Several men emerged, their laughter loud, their gaits unsteady. They noticed her immediately. "Well, well," one called out, his words slurring. "What do we have here? Lady sitting all alone in the dark?" Evelyn didn't respond, didn't move. She'd learned long ago that engaging with such men only encouraged them. "Maybe she needs some company," another suggested, and they began to cross the street, their boots loud on the packed dirt. "That's enough, boys." A new voice, sharp with authority. A tall man stepped from the shadows near the general store. The sheriff, judging by the star on his vest. He moved between Evelyn and the approaching men with casual confidence. "Mrs. Brennan's is 2 doors down. I suggest you head that way." "We weren't doing nothing, Sheriff Turner. And you're going to keep it that way." He waited until they'd shuffled off, muttering, before turning to Evelyn. His face was weathered, his eyes thoughtful in the lamplight from the saloon. "Miss, it's not safe for a lady alone out here after dark." "I'm waiting for someone." "I heard." He tilted his head, studying her. "Heard you've been waiting since the train came in. That's near 3 hours now." "Then you understand why I can't leave." Sheriff Turner sighed, a sound of resignation rather than irritation. He was perhaps 40, with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to read situations quickly. "Miss Moore, is it?" "Yes." "I'm Sheriff James Turner. I've known Caleb Grant for 5 years since he came to Pine Hollow. He's a good man, but he's complicated. Lost his wife in childbirth, and the grief nearly broke him. Barely speaks to anyone, barely comes to town. Lives out there with his little girl, just the 2 of them." Evelyn's hands tightened on her bag. "He wrote to me, multiple letters. He asked me to come." Something shifted in the sheriff's expression. Surprise, quickly masked. "Caleb wrote to you? You're certain?" "Of course I'm certain. I have the letters." May I see them? It was presumptuous, perhaps even rude, but something in his tone made Evelyn reach into her carpetbag. She withdrew the bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon, and handed them over. The sheriff moved closer to the lamplight, reading quickly, his frown deepening with each page. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Caleb hasn't... He wouldn't..." He looked up at her, and now there was genuine concern in his eyes. "Miss Moore, when did you receive the first letter?" "July." He responded to an advertisement I placed in the Matrimonial Times. "And these letters came regularly?" "Every 2 weeks. The last one confirmed my arrival date, see?" She pointed to the relevant passage, her finger trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. Sheriff Turner read it again, then shook his head slowly. "Miss, I don't know how to tell you this gently, so I'll be plain. This isn't Caleb's handwriting. I've seen his hand many times. Receipts, orders for the furniture he builds. This is neater, more careful. Caleb writes like a man who learned late and never got comfortable with it. These letters are written by someone who's had proper schooling." The world tilted. Evelyn reached for the bench behind her, needing its solidity. "That's not possible. Who else would—" "I don't know. But I do know Caleb hasn't been expecting anyone. Last time I saw him, about a week ago when he came in for supplies, he didn't mention a thing about a bride arriving." The word bride hung in the air between them, suddenly absurd. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart, not yet, but the careful structure she'd built to contain her hope. She'd sold almost everything she owned to afford this journey. She'd resigned from her position, said goodbye to the few friends she had, turned her back on the only life she'd known. For letters, for promises, for a lie. "There has to be an explanation," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Maybe." Sheriff Turner folded the letters carefully and handed them back. "But standing here in the cold won't find it. Mrs. Brennan's boarding house is warm, and she serves a decent supper. In the morning, I can ride out to Caleb's place with you, get this sorted." "No." The word came out sharp, final. Evelyn stood, gathering her bags. "If there's been a misunderstanding, I'll address it myself. You said his property is 3 miles north?" "Miss Moore, it's full dark now, and that road isn't safe for someone who doesn't know it. There's creek crossings, uneven ground. I can walk 3 miles. Not tonight, you can't." His voice turned firm, almost parental. "I'm not letting you wander into the wilderness alone. You'll stay at Mrs. Brennan's, and tomorrow I'll take you to Grant's place myself. That's the end of it." Evelyn wanted to argue, to insist on her independence, her right to make her own mistakes. But exhaustion was settling into her bones, and the temperature had dropped further, her breath forming small clouds in the lamplight. The sheriff was right, even if accepting his help felt like admitting defeat. "Very well," she said quietly. "Mrs. Brennan's boarding house." "Good." Relief colored his tone. He picked up her heavier bag before she could protest and gestured toward the street. "This way." They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing off the false-fronted buildings. Evelyn tried to ignore the faces in windows, the conversations that paused as they passed. The town was small enough that her presence had already become gossip, her abandonment on the platform a story to be shared over supper tables and whispered in shops. The woman who came all this way for a man who didn't want her. Mrs. Brennan's boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wide porch and lace curtains in every window. Light spilled from inside, warm and inviting, mocking Evelyn's cold reality. The sheriff climbed the steps and knocked, and a moment later the door opened to reveal a stout woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and flour-dusted hands. "Sheriff Turner?" She wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze moving past him to Evelyn. "And you must be the young lady from the train. I heard you were still waiting." Of course she had. The entire town had probably heard. "Mrs. Brennan, this is Miss Evelyn Moore. She needs a room for the night." "Does she now?" Mrs. Brennan stepped back, allowing them entry into a hallway that smelled of baking bread and lemon oil. "Well, come in then, both of you. No sense standing in the cold." The interior was meticulously clean, almost aggressively neat. Evelyn counted 4 doors off the main hallway, stairs leading up to the second floor, and a parlor to the right where 2 elderly gentlemen sat playing checkers. They looked up as she entered, curiosity naked on their faces. "I have a room at the back," Mrs. Brennan said, all business now. "Quiet, overlooks the garden. $2 a week, includes breakfast and supper. Laundry costs extra." "Just one night," Evelyn said, pulling coins from her reticule. The weight of her remaining money was distressingly light. "Perhaps two." $2 for 2 nights, then." Mrs. Brennan accepted the coins, testing their weight with practiced efficiency. "Supper's past, but I can bring you a plate. You look half frozen, poor thing." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Evelyn's composure. She blinked hard, focusing on the floral wallpaper, the ticking clock on the mantel, anything but the sympathy in Mrs. Brennan's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "That would be most appreciated." "I'll leave you in Mrs. Brennan's capable hands," Sheriff Turner said, setting down Evelyn's bag. "I'll come by tomorrow morning, around 9. We'll ride out to Grant's place together." "Sheriff," Evelyn paused, choosing her words carefully. "Does Mr. Grant have a daughter?" "Lila. She's 6, maybe 7 by now. Sweet little thing, though quiet as a mouse. Lost her mother before she could remember her. Caleb does his best, but raising a girl alone—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Why do you ask?" "Just something you said earlier, about him living with his daughter." But Evelyn's mind was already working, turning over possibilities. A child, letters written in careful, educated script. Someone who's had proper schooling. Could a 6-year-old write those letters? It seemed impossible. But children could be clever, and loneliness could make them desperate. "Get some rest, Miss Moore," the sheriff said, interrupting her thoughts. "Things may look clear in the morning." He left, and Mrs. Brennan led Evelyn up the narrow stairs to a small room at the back of the house. It was simple but clean, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window overlooking a dark garden. The boarding house owner lit the lamp on the bedside table, and warm light filled the space. "I'll bring your supper up," she said. Then, surprisingly, she placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Whatever brought you here, dear, and whatever disappointment you've met, you're safe now. We'll sort it out." Alone, Evelyn sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She'd been so certain, so convinced that the letters represented a genuine connection, a chance at a life she'd dared to want. She'd ignored the warnings from other teachers, the concerned looks from friends, the voice in her own head that whispered it was too good to be true. And now, here she was, in a strange town with almost no money, no prospects, and no idea what she would find tomorrow at Caleb Grant's cabin. She pulled the letters from her bag and spread them on the bed, reading them again with new eyes. The handwriting was indeed careful, almost painstakingly so. The word choices were thoughtful, but sometimes oddly formal, as if the writer was trying very hard to sound adult. And there were small things she'd dismissed before. A smudge here, a slightly crooked line there, the faint impression of what might be practice attempts showing through from previous pages. "Your decision brings light to a house that has known too much darkness." What child would write such a thing? And yet, what adult would forge such elaborate lies? A knock at the door interrupted her examination. Mrs. Brennan entered with a tray, stew still steaming, fresh bread with butter, and tea so hot it fogged in the cool air. "You'll feel better with food in you," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. She hesitated, then added, "I won't pry into your business, Miss Moore, but if you need help or advice or just someone to talk to, I've lived in Pine Hollow for 20 years. I know most everyone and most everything that happens here." "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That's very kind." "Not kind, just practical. Women on the frontier have to look out for each other." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Caleb Grant's not a bad man. Broken, maybe, but not bad. Whatever confusion brought you here, I don't believe it was meant cruelly." When she left, Evelyn forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She was exhausted, but knew sleep would be elusive. Her mind kept returning to those letters, to the careful script, to the possibility that had begun forming in her thoughts. A child. A lonely child, living in isolation with a grieving father. A child clever enough to copy an adult's voice. desperate enough to reach across a continent for help. "I picked you for my daddy." The words came unbidden, as if she'd already heard them, already knew them. Evelyn set down her spoon and went to the window, looking out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, 3 miles north past a creek she'd never seen, was a cabin where a man lived who knew nothing of her arrival. And perhaps, a little girl who knew everything. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow she would face Caleb Grant, would confront this mystery, would decide what came next. But tonight, in this small room in a strange town, Evelyn Moore made herself a promise. Whatever she discovered at that cabin, whatever truth awaited her in the morning, she would not be reduced to a story of pity, would not become the woman who came all this way for nothing. She'd survived worse than disappointment. She'd survived her parents' deaths, survived the drudgery of teaching thankless students, survived the slow death of giving up on every dream she'd once held. If this was another ending, another door closing in her face, then so be it. But if it was something else, if that careful handwriting held even a grain of truth, even a whisper of real need, then she would not turn away. Evelyn finished her meal, washed her face in the cold water from the basin, and lay down on the unfamiliar bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Brennan moving about downstairs, the murmur of voices from the parlor, the distant sound of piano music from the saloon. Normal sounds of life continuing, indifferent to her crisis. She closed her eyes and let herself remember why she'd answered that advertisement in the first place. Not because she was desperate, though she had been. Not because she was running away, though she was. But because somewhere in those careful letters, she'd heard an echo of her own loneliness, her own hunger for something more than the narrow life she'd been living. Your decision brings light to a house that has known too much darkness. Whether written by man or child, that sentence was true. She could feel it. And tomorrow, when she finally met Caleb Grant, and whatever waited in his cabin, she would find out if there was any light left in her to give. Sleep came eventually, fitful and dream-haunted. In her dreams, she walked through endless forests of pine, following a voice she couldn't quite hear, searching for a house she couldn't quite see. And always, just ahead of her, a small figure in a patched dress, running faster than Evelyn could follow, leaving footprints that disappeared as soon as they were made. She woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of coffee drifting up from below. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came back. The platform, the waiting, the truth she'd learned about the letters. Evelyn rose and dressed carefully, putting on her other traveling dress, the dark blue one that wouldn't show dust from the road. She repacked her bags, checked her remaining money, and went downstairs where Mrs. Brennan had already set out breakfast for her early-rising boarders. "Sheriff Turner will be here soon," the older woman said, pouring Evelyn a cup of strong coffee. "Eat something first. It's a rough ride out to Grant's place." Evelyn managed some eggs and toast, forcing herself to eat despite the anxiety twisting her stomach. The 2 elderly gentlemen from the night before nodded politely but didn't speak, sensing perhaps that she needed silence. She was finishing her second cup of coffee when she heard horses outside. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Turner dismounting, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare, saddled for riding. This was it, the moment of truth. Evelyn stood, smoothed her skirts, and reached for her bags. Mrs. Brennan stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Leave those here for now," she said quietly. "You can always come back for them." The implication hung in the air. You might need to come back. You might not be staying. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan, for everything." Outside, the morning air was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Sheriff Turner helped Evelyn onto the mare, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. "Have you ridden much, Miss Moore?" "Some. It's been a while." "Rosie here's gentle as a lamb. Just hold the reins steady and she'll follow my horse." He swung up onto his own mount, a large bay gelding. "You ready?" No, she wasn't ready, but she nodded anyway because what choice did she have? They rode north through the awakening town, past the general store just opening its doors, past the church with its white-painted steeple, past the last scattered houses until there was nothing but open land and the forest of pines ahead. The road, such as it was, became a rutted track winding between the trees. Sheriff Turner set an easy pace, clearly mindful of Evelyn's riding skills. They crossed a shallow creek, the horses picking their way carefully over smooth stones. The forest deepened, pine scent thick in the cool air, birds calling from hidden branches. "About another mile," the sheriff said, breaking the silence they'd maintained since leaving town. "His cabin's in a clearing near Miller's Creek. Good spot. Sheltered from the worst winds, close to water." "Does he have neighbors?" "Not close ones. Peterson Ranch is about 2 miles east, but they keep to themselves mostly. Caleb's place is pretty isolated, which is how he likes it. And the little girl, Lila, she doesn't go to school?" Sheriff Turner's jaw tightened. "There's been talk about that. Technically, the law says children should be educated, but out here, enforcing it's another matter. Some folks think Caleb ought to send her to town for lessons, but..." He shrugged. "She seems bright enough when you see her. Shy, but bright." They rode in silence for another few minutes, the track narrowing, branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns. Then the trees opened up, and Evelyn saw it. A cabin nestled at the edge of a clearing, weathered logs chinked with moss, a stone chimney at one end. Smoke rose from it, thin and gray in the morning light. Someone was home. Sheriff Turner reined in his horse, and Evelyn did the same, her heart hammering. The cabin looked solid but lonely, its single window reflecting the sky. A small barn stood behind it, and beyond that she could see the gleam of water. The creek, she supposed. It was a harsh kind of beautiful, isolated, and stark. The cabin door opened, and a man stepped out, Caleb Grant. Even from this distance, Evelyn could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand moved instinctively to his side where a working man might carry tools. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing rough work clothes and an expression that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains in the distance. He stared at them, motionless, as they approached. Sheriff Turner raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, Caleb. Got a situation here that needs sorting." "Turner." The voice was deep, rough with disuse. His gaze moved to Evelyn, and she saw his eyes, dark, guarded, filled with something that might have been grief or anger, or both. "Who's this?" Before the sheriff could answer, a small figure darted out from behind the cabin, moving so quickly she was almost a blur. A girl with long brown hair and braids, wearing a patched calico dress too thin for the weather. She stopped abruptly when she saw the visitors, her eyes going wide. Those eyes fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that was almost frightening in its focus. "Lila!" Caleb called, his tone sharp with warning. "Inside!" But the girl didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at Evelyn with an expression of wonder and terror and desperate hope all mixed together. And in that moment, seeing that small face, those haunted eyes, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty. The letters, the careful script, the impossible hope, all of it had come from this child. "Mr. Grant," Sheriff Turner began, dismounting, "this is Miss Evelyn Moore. She arrived on yesterday's train from Philadelphia. Says she's here because you sent for her. Says you've been corresponding for months about an arrangement." Caleb's face went blank with shock, then darkened with something harder. "I sent for her? That's not possible. I never—" He stopped, his gaze snapping to his daughter. "Lila, inside, now." The girl took a step back, then another, her small hands twisting in her dress. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't run. Instead, she looked at Evelyn with such raw pleading that it broke something loose in Evelyn's chest. "Please," Lila whispered, the word barely audible across the clearing. "Please, don't leave." And Evelyn understood, in that single moment of heartbreak, that she'd traveled 2,000 miles, not for a man's promise, but for a child's desperate prayer. That everything she thought she'd lost on that platform, the hope, the future, the possibility of belonging, might actually be waiting here in this clearing, if only she was brave enough to claim it. She dismounted before she could question the impulse, her legs unsteady after the long ride. Sheriff Turner reached out to steady her, but she stepped forward on her own, moving toward the cabin, toward the man who stood like a sentinel in his doorway, toward the girl who'd gambled everything on a stranger's kindness. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with a confidence she didn't feel. "My name is Evelyn Moore, and I believe we have a great deal to discuss." Caleb Grant's face hardened like winter ice, his jaw working as he processed her words. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the pines and the distant murmur of the creek. Then he stepped down from the porch, his boots heavy on the packed earth, and Evelyn saw him fully for the first time. He was perhaps 30, though grief had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, unshaven, weathered by sun and work. His hands were calloused and scarred, a carpenter's hands, and they hung at his sides now like weapons he didn't know whether to use. But it was his eyes that held her, dark as the forest at dusk, filled with a wariness that bordered on fury. "Sheriff," he said, never looking away from Evelyn, "I don't know what kind of scheme this is, but I never sent for anyone, never wrote to anyone, never made any arrangement." "She has letters, Caleb, signed with your name." "Then they're forgeries or mistakes." "I don't care which." His voice was rough, unused to conversation, edged with the kind of anger that comes from violation. "I want her gone." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow, but she kept her spine straight, her chin up. She'd expected this, hadn't she? But expecting rejection and experiencing it were two different things entirely. "Mr. Grant, I understand this is a shock." "You understand nothing." He turned to Sheriff Turner, dismissing her as if she were no more significant than the wind. "Take her back to town. I don't know who she is or what she wants, but she's not staying here." "Papa, no!" Lila's voice cracked through the tension like breaking glass. She ran forward, placing herself between her father and the strangers, her small body trembling but determined. "Please, Papa, please don't send her away. I need her. We need her." Caleb's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, pain, perhaps, or recognition. He stared at his daughter, and Evelyn watched understanding dawn slowly across his features. "Lila." His voice had gone quiet, dangerous. "What did you do?" The girl's courage faltered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "I wrote the letters, Papa. I found the paper in your desk, and I practiced and practiced until I could write nice enough. I sent them to the newspaper like Mrs. Peterson told me people did when they were lonely. I just wanted—" Her voice broke. "I just wanted someone to help, someone to stay." The silence that followed was terrible. Caleb seemed to fold inward, his shoulders sagging as if under an impossible weight. He raised one hand to his face, pressed his palm against his eyes, and when he lowered it, all the anger had drained away, leaving only exhaustion. 7 years old, he whispered. "You're 7 years old, Lila. How could you possibly—" He couldn't finish. He looked at Evelyn then, really looked at her, and she saw apology and shame and desperate weariness all tangled together. "Miss Moore, there are no words. What my daughter did was wrong, unforgivable. The deception, the cost to you, the cost was mine to pay," Evelyn interrupted quietly. "No one forced me onto that train. I came because I chose to." "You came because you were lied to, by a child who doesn't understand what she's done." He reached for Lila's shoulder, pulled her gently but firmly to his side. "She'll apologize, and then the sheriff will take you back to town. I'll pay for your return fare to Philadelphia, your lodging until the next train east. It's the least I can do." Sheriff Turner cleared his throat. "Caleb, maybe we should all go inside, talk this through properly. It's cold out here, and Miss Moore's had a long journey. There's nothing to talk through." "I think there is." Evelyn spoke before she could question the wisdom of it. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. Caleb's hostile, the sheriff's surprised, Lila's desperately hopeful. "Your daughter didn't do this on a whim, Mr. Grant. She wrote multiple letters over 3 months. She maintained a correspondence. She convinced me of a reality that, while false in its authorship, might be true in its need. We don't need—" "Yes, you do." The words came out sharper than she intended, sharpened by her own anger and fear and the reckless courage of having nothing left to lose. "Look at her, Mr. Grant. Really look at her. She's 7 years old, living in isolation with a father who, by all accounts, barely speaks to anyone. She's clever enough to forge letters, desperate enough to reach across a continent for help, and brave enough to stand here now knowing she might be punished for it. That's not the behavior of a child who's thriving." Caleb's face darkened again, but this time there was something defensive in it, something wounded. I take care of my daughter. I don't doubt that you keep her fed and sheltered. But is she educated? Does she have friends, playmates, any contact with other children? Does she know how to read beyond what she's taught herself? Does she— Enough. His voice cracked like a whip. You know nothing about us. Nothing about what we've survived, what we've lost. You have no right. You're absolutely correct. Evelyn stepped forward, close enough now to see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray threading through the dark hair at his temples. I have no right to judge you, but I do have the right to speak for myself, and here is my truth, Mr. Grant. I sold everything I owned to come here. I gave up my position, my home, my life, such as it was. I have $17 to my name and no prospects in Philadelphia worth returning to. So before you put me on that train east, answer me one question honestly. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Does your daughter know how to read? The silence stretched. Lila looked up at her father, biting her lip. Caleb stared at Evelyn with something that might have been hatred or might have been fear of exposure. She knows some, he said finally. I've taught her what I can. And arithmetic? History? Geography? Science? She doesn't need— Yes, she does. Every child does. And you know it, or you wouldn't look so angry right now. Evelyn softened her voice slightly, seeing the pain beneath his defensiveness. I'm not here to judge your parenting, Mr. Grant. I'm here because I'm a teacher. I've spent 6 years educating young ladies in Philadelphia, and whatever brought me to your door, deception or fate or a child's desperate gamble, the fact remains that I'm here now, and I'm qualified to help. Sheriff Turner shifted his weight, his horse snorting softly. She has a point, Caleb. The girl could use some proper schooling. We can't afford— I'm not asking for money. Evelyn spoke quickly, sensing an opening. I'm asking for a chance. Let me stay for 1 week. Let me teach Lila, see if I can help. At the end of that week, if you still want me gone, I'll leave without argument. But if there's even a possibility that I could make a difference here, don't you owe it to your daughter to try? Caleb looked down at Lila, and Evelyn watched the war play out across his face. Pride fought with practicality. Anger struggled against love. The desire to maintain control battled with the undeniable truth that his daughter needed more than he could give her alone. Please, Papa. Lila's voice was small but steady. I picked her. I picked her special. I read all the letters in the newspaper, and hers was the kindest. She talked about teaching children to love learning, about making lessons fun. She sounded like she might understand. Understand what, baby? Being lonely. The words hung in the morning air, simple and devastating. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the fight had gone out of him. 1 week, he said roughly. But you sleep in the barn. I'll clean out the tack room, make it suitable. And you teach Lila only, nothing else. You don't cook, don't clean, don't interfere with how I run my household. When the week's done, if I say you leave, you leave. No arguments. Agreed. Evelyn's heart hammered with relief and terror in equal measure. She'd bought herself 7 days. 7 days to prove her worth, to make herself indispensable, to find a place in this broken little family. It was more than she'd had 5 minutes ago. Sheriff Turner exhaled slowly, clearly relieved to have avoided further conflict. I'll ride back to town. Let Mrs. Brennan know to hold Miss Moore's things for now. Caleb, I trust you'll behave like a gentleman. She'll be perfectly safe. The words were stiff but sincere. Caleb extended his hand to the sheriff, shook it firmly. Thank you for bringing her out, and for not making this harder than it needed to be. Just try to make it work, both of you. That little girl deserves a chance. Sheriff Turner tipped his hat to Evelyn. Good luck, Miss Moore. You'll need it. He rode away, and Evelyn was left standing in the clearing with a man who resented her presence and a child who'd gambled everything on her arrival. The silence felt heavy, uncomfortable. Caleb stood with his hand on Lila's shoulder, his expression unreadable. Lila stared at Evelyn with barely contained joy, as if afraid that blinking might make her disappear. The barn's around back, Caleb said finally. I'll show you where you'll sleep. Lila, go inside and start on your chores. But Papa! Now, Lila. The girl hesitated, then ran to Evelyn and wrapped her thin arms around her waist in a sudden, fierce embrace. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not being angry at me. Evelyn bent down, cupping the small face in her hands. Up close, she could see the hunger in those eyes, the desperate need for connection that must have driven her to such lengths. I'm not angry, Lila. I'm impressed. What you did took remarkable courage. But we'll need to talk about honesty and the right ways to ask for help, yes? Yes, ma'am. Lila nodded eagerly. I'll be good. I promise I'll be so good. I know you will. Evelyn smoothed back a strand of hair that had escaped from the girl's braid. Now go do your chores. Your father and I need to talk. Lila ran toward the cabin, her steps light, almost dancing. She paused at the door to wave, then disappeared inside. Caleb watched her go with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. She's not usually so open, he said quietly. Strangers make her shy. I'm not a stranger to her. Not really. She's been living with my letters for months. Letters she thought I wrote. He turned to face Evelyn fully, and she saw the exhaustion in every line of his body. She doesn't know you at all, Miss Moore. She knows a fantasy she created from words on paper. Perhaps, but children are often better judges of character than adults give them credit for. She chose me from dozens of responses. That has to mean something. It means she's 7 and doesn't understand consequences. He started walking toward the barn, and Evelyn followed, her skirt swishing through the long grass. I'll be honest with you, Miss Moore. I don't want you here. I don't like strangers. I don't trust easily, and I especially don't trust people who show up uninvited making demands on my hospitality. I made no demands. You invited me to stay. Only because refusing would make me the villain in my daughter's eyes. He pushed open the barn door, revealing a dim interior that smelled of hay and horses and leather. 2 stalls held a pair of sturdy workhorses who turned their heads to watch the newcomers. And because, much as I hate to admit it, you're right. Lila needs proper schooling, and I can't give it to her. Why not? Evelyn asked, genuinely curious. You're clearly educated yourself. Your work requires mathematics, planning, precision. You could teach her. Could, maybe. But I work from dawn to dusk just to keep us fed and sheltered. The furniture I build, that's our income. If I'm not working, we don't eat. It's that simple. He led her to a small room at the back of the barn, little more than a closet with walls. Saddles and bridles hung from pegs, and tools lined makeshift shelves. This'll take some cleaning, but it's weather-tight. I'll bring in a cot, some blankets. You'll have privacy. Evelyn surveyed the space, which was considerably smaller than the room she'd left at Mrs. Brennan's. But it was shelter, and it was hers, at least for a week. It will be fine, thank you. Caleb grunted, already pulling down saddles and stacking them outside the door. You'll take your meals with us. I'm not much of a cook, but it's edible. And you'll teach Lila in the main room where I can see you both. I want to know what you're teaching her. Of course. Evelyn moved to help him clear the space, but he waved her off. I'll handle this. You should, I don't know, get settled. Or something. He paused, leather reins in his hands, not looking at her. Miss Moore, I need you to understand something. My daughter is everything to me. The only thing. If you hurt her, if you disappoint her, if you make promises you can't keep, I won't. You can't know that. People leave. People die. Promises break. The rawness in his voice spoke of experience, of wounds that hadn't healed. Sarah, my wife, she promised we'd build a life here. Promised she'd be fine, that women had babies every day, that I was worrying over nothing. Then she died screaming in our bed while I stood there useless, holding our newborn daughter and watching the only person I'd ever loved bleed to death. Evelyn's breath caught. I'm so sorry. I don't want your sorry. I want you to understand what's at stake here. Lila's already lost her mother. She doesn't need to lose anyone else. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark with old pain. So whatever you do this week, whatever you teach her, don't make her love you. Don't become someone she can't live without. Because in 7 days you're probably leaving, and I'll be the one left picking up the pieces. And if I don't leave, you will. They always do. He turned back to his work, dismissing her. I'll have this ready in an hour. Until then, you can wait in the cabin if you want. Lila would probably enjoy the company. Evelyn left him to his labor and crossed the clearing to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open carefully, not wanting to intrude. The interior was dim after the bright morning sun, but her eyes adjusted quickly. It was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, reached by a ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a black kettle hanging from an iron hook. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat near the single window, and a rocking chair occupied the corner nearest the fire. Shelves held dishes, supplies, tools. Everything was functional, utilitarian, without a single decorative touch except for a faded quilt folded over the rocking chair. Lila sat on the floor near the fireplace, a rag in one hand and a small pile of potatoes beside her. She looked up as Evelyn entered, her face brightening immediately. "Papa says I have to peel these for supper. Do you want to help? We could talk while we work." Evelyn remembered Caleb's words. You don't cook, don't clean, don't interfere. But surely sitting with a child while she worked wasn't interference. She settled onto the floor beside Lila, careful of her skirts, and picked up a potato and the spare knife. "I'd be happy to help. And yes, we should talk. About your letters, for one thing." Lila's hands stilled. "Are you very angry?" "I'm not angry, but I am curious. How did you learn to write so well? Your father said he's been teaching you, but those letters were quite sophisticated for a 7-year-old. Pride flickered across the girl's face. "I'm a good learner. Papa taught me letters and how to sound out words, but I wanted to know more. So when he goes to town, he brings me books. Old ones from people who don't want them anymore. I read everything. Mrs. Peterson, she lives at the ranch. She gave me some paper and pencils last year for my birthday. She said every child should know how to write proper letters. And you used that paper to write to me." "I practiced first, so much practice. I filled up all the papers Mrs. Peterson gave me, then I had to use Papa's work papers when he wasn't looking. I wanted to sound like a grown-up so you'd take it seriously, so you'd want to come." Lila set down her potato, her small face grave. "I know it was wrong to lie. Papa always says lying is about the worst thing you can do. But I didn't know what else to do. He won't listen when I try to talk to him about needing help. He just says we're fine, we don't need anyone. But we're not fine, Miss Moore. We're so lonely it hurts." The simple honesty of it broke Evelyn's heart. "Tell me about your days here. What's it like?" "Papa works all the time. He builds things, tables, chairs, cabinets. People from town come to order them, or he takes them to sell at the general store. While he works, I'm supposed to do chores and read my books and stay quiet so I don't disturb him. Sometimes Mrs. Peterson visits and brings me things, fabric scraps for my doll, or candy, or once a whole orange that came all the way from California. But mostly it's just Papa and me, and he doesn't talk much. He's sad all the time, even when he smiles." "Do you remember your mother at all?" Lila shook her head. "Just what Papa's told me, that she was pretty and kind and loved to sing, that she wanted me very much, that she died so I could live, and that's why I have to be good and not cause trouble." She looked up at Evelyn with eyes far too old for her young face. "Sometimes I think Papa looks at me and sees her dying. I think maybe that's why he keeps so quiet, because I remind him of the worst day of his life." "Oh, sweetheart, no." Evelyn set down her knife and pulled the girl close. "I don't know your father well, but I saw his face when he looked at you today. You're not a reminder of loss to him. You're everything he has left to love. He's just lost. Grief can do that to people. It can make them forget how to live, how to open up, how to let anyone else in. That's why I needed you to come." Lila's voice was muffled against Evelyn's shoulder. "I thought maybe if there was someone else here, someone who could talk to Papa and teach me and maybe make us feel less lonely, maybe we could be happy again, or happy for the first time since I never knew us when we were happy before. That's a heavy burden for a 7-year-old to carry. I'm 8 next month, and Papa says I'm very mature for my age." Evelyn smiled despite the ache in her chest. "I don't doubt that. But maturity doesn't mean you have to solve adult problems by yourself. What you did, writing those letters, bringing me here, it was brave and clever, but also dangerous. Do you understand that? Because you might have been bad? Yes. Or because the situation could have turned out very differently. Your father could have refused to let me stay even for a week. I could have been angry enough to demand compensation I knew you couldn't provide. There are many ways this could have gone wrong. But it didn't." Lila pulled back, her face earnest. "You're here. You're staying for a whole week. And maybe if you're really helpful and Papa sees how much better everything is with you here, He'll let you stay longer, maybe forever. Lila, I need you to understand something important. I'm grateful for this opportunity, truly. But your father made it very clear that this is temporary. I can't promise I'll stay beyond the week we've agreed to. I can't promise anything except that I'll do my best to teach you well while I'm here. But you want to stay, don't you? You don't have anywhere else to go. The blunt truth of it stung. That's not the point. The point is you need us as much as we need you. Lila's voice was matter of fact, without judgment. You came all this way because you were lonely too. You answered Papa's advertisement, my advertisement, because you wanted a home and a family and a place to belong. I read it in your letters, how you talked about wanting to make a difference, wanting to matter to someone. So maybe this is where you're supposed to be. Maybe I picked you because somehow I knew. Evelyn stared at this extraordinary child, this 8-year-old philosopher with ink-stained fingers and hope in her eyes. You're very wise for someone so young. Mrs. Peterson says that too. She says I'm an old soul. Lila picked up her potato again, resuming her peeling with practiced efficiency. Will you really teach me? Proper lessons, like you gave those girls in Philadelphia? Even better. Those girls often didn't want to learn. They were there because their parents insisted. But you, Lila Grant, you're hungry for knowledge. That makes all the difference. Evelyn returned to her own potato, falling into a comfortable rhythm. We'll start tomorrow with an assessment to see what you already know. Then we'll create a curriculum that covers reading, writing, arithmetic, history, basic science, and geography. Does that sound acceptable? It sounds wonderful. Lila's smile could have lit the dim cabin. Will you teach me about other places? I want to know what Philadelphia looks like, and New York, and all the cities I've only read about in books. I'll teach you about everywhere I've been, and many places I haven't. We'll look at maps together, trace routes across continents, imagine ourselves in London and Paris and Rome. I can't imagine anything better. They worked in companionable silence for a while, peeling potatoes and cutting them into chunks for whatever meal Caleb would prepare later. Through the window, Evelyn could see him emerging from the barn, carrying an armload of tools. He looked toward the cabin, his expression unreadable from this distance, then headed toward a work shed she hadn't noticed before. He's probably going to work on Mr. Harrison's table, Lila said, following her gaze. He promised it by next week, and he's worried he won't finish in time. He worries about that a lot, disappointing people, not meeting his promises. That's why he was so upset about the letters. Not just because I lied, but because now someone's disappointed because of him, even though it wasn't really his fault. Your father seems like a good man carrying too much responsibility alone. He is good. He's just sad and scared and doesn't know how to be different. Lila set aside the last peeled potato and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. I should start the fire for supper. Papa likes it ready when he comes in so he doesn't have to stop working any longer than necessary. Do you do this every day? The cooking, I mean. Most days. Papa showed me how when I was little. He says a woman needs to know how to keep a house. She paused, adding with perfect innocence. That's why I thought he'd want a wife. For the cooking and cleaning and company. I didn't understand he was too sad to want those things. Evelyn helped gather kindling, watching as Lila efficiently built up the fire. The girl moved with the confidence of long practice, clearly accustomed to managing household tasks far beyond her years. It was impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure. Miss Moore? Lila asked as she hung the pot of potatoes over the fire. What should I call you? Miss Moore feels very formal for someone who's going to be teaching me every day. What would you like to call me? Could I call you Miss Evelyn? That sounds friendlier, like we're family, almost. Miss Evelyn would be perfect. They spent the rest of the morning together, Lila chattering about her books and her dreams, while Evelyn listened and observed. The girl was indeed remarkably bright, her vocabulary extensive, her curiosity boundless. She'd taught herself to read beyond basic comprehension, and her questions ranged from the practical, how did trains work, to the philosophical. Why did some people have so much while others had so little? Around noon, Caleb appeared in the doorway, his shirt dusty with sawdust, his face tired. He glanced between Lila and Evelyn, seeming surprised to find them sitting together at the table, a battered primer open between them. Just checking that everything's acceptable, he said gruffly. Very acceptable, Papa. Miss Evelyn's been telling me about Philadelphia, and she says tomorrow we'll start real lessons with a proper curriculum and everything. That's good. That's good. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I should get back to work. Lila, don't bother Miss Moore too much. She's not bothering me at all, Evelyn assured him. She's been helping me understand what she already knows so I can plan appropriately. Caleb nodded, already backing toward the door. But Lila jumped up, running to him. Papa, aren't you going to eat lunch? I'll take some bread and cheese to the workshop. I need to keep working. But you always say we should eat proper meals together when we can. There was a pleading note in Lila's voice that Evelyn hadn't heard before. Miss Evelyn's here now. We could all eat together. It would be nice. Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Evelyn, then back at his daughter, clearly trapped between his desire to maintain distance and his inability to deny Lila anything. I suppose I could take a short break. They ate simple fare. Bread, cheese, some dried apples. Sitting around the small table in uncomfortable silence, Caleb kept his eyes on his plate, eating with mechanical efficiency. Lila kept trying to spark conversation, telling her father about the lessons planned for tomorrow, but his responses were monosyllabic at best. Finally, Evelyn broke the tension. Mr. Grant, I wanted to thank you for preparing the space in the barn. I'm sure it was an inconvenience, and I appreciate the effort. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, as if he'd forgotten she could speak. It's adequate? More than adequate. It's quite comfortable. Good. He returned to his food, but after a moment added, There's a basin out there now, and I brought a pitcher for water. Lila can show you where the well is, and there's extra blankets if you need them. Gets cold at night this time of year. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Another silence. Then Lila, bless her, tried again. Papa, Miss Evelyn says she can teach me about geography and history and all sorts of things you don't have time to teach. Isn't that wonderful? Very wonderful, Caleb agreed, but his tone was flat. And maybe she could help you too sometimes, with reading orders or keeping accounts or… Lila! The warning in his voice was clear. Miss Moore is here to teach you, not to work for us. Don't ask for more than what's been agreed. I was just thinking, I know what you were thinking. But this isn't permanent, baby. You understand that, right? Miss Moore has her own life, her own plans. She's doing us a kindness by staying this week, but then she'll need to return to her real life. Evelyn saw the hope drain from Lila's face, replaced by stubborn determination. But what if she doesn't want to leave? What if she likes it here? It doesn't matter what any of us want. Life isn't about want. It's about reality, and reality is that Miss Moore belongs somewhere else. He pushed back from the table, his meal barely touched. I need to get back to work. Thank you for lunch. He was gone before either of them could respond, the door closing with deliberate care. Not a slam, but a statement nonetheless. Lila stared after him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He's trying to protect you, Evelyn said gently. He doesn't want you to hope for something that might not happen. But it could happen. If we show him how good it is with you here. If we prove we're better as 3 instead of 2. Lila, listen to me. Your father is right. I can't make promises about staying. But what I can promise is that this week I'll give you my full attention and effort. I'll teach you as much as I possibly can. And whatever happens after that, you'll have those lessons, that knowledge. No one can take that away from you. It wasn't enough. Evelyn could see it in the girl's face, the disappointment and frustration. But Lila was learning, even now, one of life's hardest lessons, that wanting something desperately doesn't make it so. They cleaned up the lunch dishes together, and then Evelyn suggested they use the afternoon to prepare materials for the next day's lessons. Lila brightened somewhat at this, eager to help, and they spent hours creating makeshift teaching aids from whatever materials they could find. Scraps of paper became alphabet cards. A stick and some ash from the fireplace created a makeshift slate. Lila's worn books were organized by subject and difficulty. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Evelyn became aware of the rhythmic sound of sawing and hammering from Caleb's workshop. The man was as good as his word. He worked ceaselessly, pausing only when absolutely necessary. It was both admirable and concerning. No one could maintain such a pace indefinitely without breaking. As evening approached, Lila began preparing supper. a stew using the potatoes they'd peeled earlier, along with some preserved meat and vegetables from the root cellar. Evelyn offered to help, but remembered Caleb's restrictions and instead busied herself organizing her few belongings in the barn room. It was indeed comfortable, surprisingly so. Caleb had brought in a decent cot with a thick mattress, several quilts, a small table and chair, and even a lantern with extra oil. The space was clean and private, smelling of hay and leather, but not unpleasantly so. She could hear the horses shifting in their stalls, their presence somehow comforting. She was hanging her spare dress on a peg when Lila appeared in the doorway, her face anxious. "Supper's ready, Miss Evelyn. Will you come eat with us?" "Of course." They walked back to the cabin together as dusk settled over the clearing. Through the workshop window, Evelyn could see lamplight and Caleb's silhouette bent over his work. Lila hesitated, then ran to knock on the workshop door. "Papa, supper's ready." "I'll eat later," came the muffled response. "But Papa, you need to eat while it's hot. And Miss Evelyn's here, it's not polite to—" The door opened and Caleb stood framed in lamplight, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "Lila, I said I'll eat later, don't argue." "Please? Just this once? I made it specially, and I want us all to eat together like a proper family." "We're not a family." The words came out harsh, too harsh, and Evelyn saw him immediately regret them. But the damage was done. Lila's face crumpled, and she turned and ran toward the cabin, tears streaming. Caleb closed his eyes, his hand gripping the doorframe. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," Evelyn said quietly. "You meant to protect her from hoping, but Mr. Grant, she's going to hope anyway. Children always do. The question is whether you let her hope alone or whether you have the courage to hope with her." "Hope for what? For you to stay? That's not happening, Miss Moore. In 6 days you'll leave, and we'll go back to how things were." "Will you? Or will Lila remember this week for the rest of her life? Remember what it felt like to have someone besides her father care about her education, her dreams, her future? Remember what it felt like to not be alone?" Evelyn stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're so busy protecting her from disappointment that you're denying her joy. Is that really what you want?" He stared at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. For a moment she thought he might argue, might order her to leave immediately. Instead, he sighed deeply. "Tell Lila I'll be there in 5 minutes. I need to clean up." He closed the door, leaving Evelyn alone in the gathering darkness. She hurried back to the cabin, where she found Lila sitting by the fire, wiping her eyes with her apron. "He's coming," Evelyn said softly. "He just needs a few minutes." "He hates me." "Oh, sweetheart, no. He loves you more than anything in this world. He's just scared." "Scared of what?" "Of losing you. Of failing you. Of not being enough." Evelyn knelt beside the girl, smoothing back her hair. "Your father lost someone he loved very much. That kind of loss changes people. It makes them afraid to open their hearts again, afraid to risk feeling that kind of pain a second time. But I won't leave him. I'm his daughter." "I know. But what you did, bringing me here, it forced him to face that fear. To acknowledge that you need more than he can give you alone. That's terrifying for a parent." The door opened and Caleb entered, his face and hands scrubbed clean, his hair damp. He looked at Lila with such raw apology that Evelyn had to look away, feeling like an intruder. "I'm sorry, Lila Bug," he said, using what must have been an old endearment. "What I said before, I didn't mean we're not a family. You and I, we're a family. We'll always be a family. I just meant that Miss Moore isn't part of—" He stopped, seeming to realize he was making it worse. Lila ran to him, and he caught her up in his arms despite her size, holding her the way he must have when she was smaller. They stayed like that for a long moment, and Evelyn discreetly turned to stir the stew, giving them privacy. When they finally sat down to eat, the atmosphere was different, still awkward, but with an undercurrent of something softer. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a companionable silence rather than a hostile one. Occasionally, Lila would comment on something, and both adults would respond. Small, careful steps toward something that might, with time and patience, resemble normalcy. After supper, while Lila washed dishes and Evelyn dried them, Caleb remained at the table, apparently too tired to immediately return to work. He watched them work together, his expression unreadable. Then, surprising everyone, he spoke. Lila, Miss Moore, I want to apologize. Not just for tonight, but for this whole situation. I should have handled it better. Should have... He trailed off, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. What I'm trying to say is that I appreciate you staying, Miss Moore, and I'll try to be less difficult about it. Thank you, Mr. Grant. That means a great deal. And Lila? He waited until his daughter looked at him. I'm proud of you for being brave enough to ask for help, even if the way you did it wasn't right. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to give you everything you need. You give me everything I need, Papa. Love and food and a home. Miss Evelyn just gives me more. The simplicity of it seemed to undo something in Caleb. He nodded once, roughly, then stood. I should get back to work for another hour or so before bed. Lila, don't stay up too late. You'll need your rest for lessons tomorrow. After he left, Lila turned to Evelyn with shining eyes. He called me Lila Bug. He hasn't used that name in years. I think maybe he's starting to see that this can work, that you being here can be good for us. Evelyn wanted to caution against too much hope, but looking at that radiant young face, she couldn't bring herself to dampen the joy. So instead, she simply smiled and suggested they plan tomorrow's lessons in more detail. They spent another hour together, sitting by the firelight, mapping out a curriculum that was ambitious but achievable. Lila's enthusiasm was infectious, and Evelyn found herself getting excited despite her uncertainty about the future. Teaching was what she loved most, and here was a student who actually wanted to learn. It was more than she'd had in years. Eventually, Lila began yawning, and Evelyn sent her up to the loft to sleep. Alone, she banked the fire and prepared to return to the barn when Caleb entered, his day's work finally done. Miss Moore, I wanted to talk to you. Alone. Evelyn's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. Of course. He poured himself a cup of water, drank it slowly, clearly buying time to find the right words. Finally, he said, I need to understand your situation, your real situation. You said you have $17 and no prospects back east. Is that true? Yes. And the teaching position you left, you can't return to it? No, I resigned formally. They've already hired my replacement. Family? Friends who could help you? I'm an orphan, Mr. Grant. My parents died of influenza when I was 19. I have no siblings, no close relatives. The friends I had in Philadelphia were professional acquaintances more than true companions. She met his eyes steadily, refusing to be ashamed of her circumstances. I came west because I had nothing left to hold me east. So yes, when your daughter wrote those letters, I saw them as an opportunity for a new beginning. Perhaps that makes me desperate, or perhaps it makes me brave. I honestly don't know anymore. He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him reassessing, recalculating. So if you leave here after the week is done, what will you do? Find work somewhere, perhaps in Pine Hollow, if there are positions available. I could teach privately, or work in a shop, or, be honest, how long would $17 last you? 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if I'm very careful. And then? I don't know. The admission cost her, but she wouldn't lie. I'd find something, I always have. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought the conversation was over. Then he said, What if I offered you a proposition? Not what Lila's hoping for, don't misunderstand me there, but a practical arrangement that could benefit both of us. Evelyn's pulse raced. I'm listening. Stay for the winter, not as my wife or anything foolish like that, but as Lila's teacher. A proper teacher with a proper salary. I can't pay much, but I could offer room and board plus $10 a month. That's all I can afford, but it would give you a place to stay through the worst weather and give Lila the education she needs. Winter? That's 4 months, roughly. Spring comes late here. He crossed his arms, defensive. It's a practical solution, Miss Moore. You need a place to stay, and Lila needs a teacher. I'm not offering anything more than that. You'd still sleep in the barn, still keep to yourself beyond the teaching hours. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. And at the end of winter? We reassess. See if the arrangement still makes sense, or if you'd rather move on. He held her gaze, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Hope, carefully guarded, but there nonetheless. I know it's not ideal, it's not what you traveled here for, but it's what I can offer, and it's genuine. Evelyn's mind raced through the implications. 4 months. A salary, however modest. Time to teach Lila properly. Time to perhaps help this broken family heal. Time to figure out her own future. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd stood alone on that platform yesterday, abandoned and lost. I accept, she said. Caleb exhaled and some of the tension left his shoulders. Good. That's good. We'll keep this between us for now. No need to get Lila's hopes up more than they already are. At the end of the week, if things are going well, we'll tell her about the extended arrangement. Mr. Grant, Caleb, if you're going to be here for months, you might as well use my given name. When we're alone, at least. Caleb, then. I want you to know that I'll honor the boundaries you've set. I'm not here to disrupt your life or to force myself into places I'm not wanted. I'm here to teach your daughter and earn my keep, that's all. I know. He moved toward the door, then paused. But, Miss Moore, Evelyn, if you do stay, if this arrangement works, try not to become too important to her. Try not to let her love you too much. Because when you eventually leave, as you will, it'll destroy her. And I don't know if I can put her back together again. He left before she could respond, his words hanging in the air like a prophecy or a warning. Evelyn stood alone in the cabin, listening to his footsteps fade toward his workshop, and wondered what she'd just agreed to. 4 months. 120 days to prove herself useful, to teach a hungry mind, to perhaps, despite all warnings and wisdom, become part of something larger than her own lonely existence. She returned to the barn, to her small room with its comfortable cot and the sound of horses breathing in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring lessons and careful negotiations of boundaries. Tomorrow would test whether a teacher, a carpenter, and a clever child could build something lasting from the fragments of their separate loneliness. But tonight, for the first time since stepping off that train, Evelyn Moore allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The morning arrived cold and clear, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Evelyn woke to the sound of Caleb already at work in his shop, the rhythmic rasp of his saw a steady heartbeat beneath the silence. She dressed quickly in the chilly air, splashed icy water on her face from the basin, and made her way to the cabin where Lila was already awake, sitting at the table with her worn primer open before her. "I've been practicing my letters," the girl announced proudly, showing Evelyn a slate covered in careful script. "I want to be ready for proper lessons." "You're more than ready," Evelyn assured her, genuinely impressed by the girl's dedication. "Now, let's see what you really know." They spent the morning in assessment, and with each passing hour, Evelyn's admiration grew. Lila could read at a level far beyond her years, her comprehension remarkable. Her arithmetic was shakier. Caleb had taught her basic addition and subtraction, but nothing more complex, and her knowledge of history and geography was spotty, gleaned entirely from whatever books had happened to come her way. But her hunger to learn was boundless, her questions insightful, her memory exceptional. By midday, Evelyn had mapped out a comprehensive curriculum that would challenge Lila without overwhelming her. They were deep in discussion about multiplication tables when Caleb appeared for lunch, pausing in the doorway to watch them bent together over the slate. "She's extraordinary," Evelyn told him quietly while Lila was washing her hands. "I've taught girls twice her age with half her ability. She has a genuine gift." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, pride mixed with sadness. "Her mother was clever too. Sarah could figure numbers faster than anyone I knew, kept all the accounts when we first came here, planned everything down to the penny." He paused, then added, "I'm glad Lila takes after her in that way." They ate lunch together, and this time the conversation flowed more easily. Lila chattered about her lessons, demonstrating her newly learned multiplication facts, and even Caleb smiled slightly at her enthusiasm. It was a small moment, ordinary in its domesticity, but Evelyn felt its significance. This was what Lila had been seeking, not just education but connection, the simple warmth of 3 people sharing a meal and conversation. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Mornings were for lessons, reading, writing, arithmetic, with breaks for recitation and discussion. Afternoons, Lila practiced what she'd learned while Evelyn prepared the next day's materials and occasionally helped with household tasks, despite Caleb's restrictions. Evenings brought supper together, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted, more genuine. Caleb remained distant, but not hostile. He listened when Lila shared what she'd learned, asked occasional questions, even smiled now and then at his daughter's excitement. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Evelyn would catch him looking at them with an expression she couldn't quite read, longing, perhaps, or regret, or something more complicated still. On the fourth day, Mrs. Peterson arrived. Evelyn heard the wagon before she saw it, the rattle of wheels and creak of wood announcing visitors. Lila ran to the window, her face lighting up. "It's Mrs. Peterson! Papa, Mrs. Peterson's here!" Caleb emerged from his workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands, his expression guarded. A stout woman in her 50s climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility, her sharp eyes taking in everything, the cabin, the workshop, and especially Evelyn, who'd stepped outside with Lila. "Caleb Grant," Mrs. Peterson called, her voice carrying authority. "I heard interesting news in town yesterday. Thought I'd come see for myself if the gossip was true." "Margaret," Caleb nodded stiffly. "What gossip would that be?" "That you've taken in a mail-order bride, that she arrived unexpected and you're keeping her in your barn." Mrs. Peterson's gaze fixed on Evelyn, assessment clear in every line of her weathered face. "You must be Miss Moore." "I am, though I'm not a mail-order bride, precisely. The situation is rather more complicated." "I imagine it is." Mrs. Peterson moved closer, studying Evelyn with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to judging horseflesh and character with equal skill. "You look educated, city-bred. What brings someone like you to the middle of nowhere?" "Mrs. Peterson," Caleb interjected, his tone warning. "Miss Moore is here as Lila's teacher, that's all." "Is that so?" The older woman's eyebrows rose. "And how are you paying for a teacher, Caleb? Last I heard you were barely scraping by." "That's my business. It's the business of anyone who cares about that child's welfare." Mrs. Peterson turned to Lila, her expression softening. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you well? Is this woman treating you kindly?" "Oh, yes, Mrs. Peterson. Miss Evelyn is wonderful. She's teaching me so many things, multiplication and geography and the history of Rome and—" "Slow down, child." But Mrs. Peterson was smiling now, the suspicion in her eyes easing slightly. She looked back at Evelyn. "May I see your teaching materials? I'd like to understand what you're offering this girl." "Of course." Evelyn led her into the cabin, spreading out the makeshift slate, the organized books, the carefully written lesson plans. Mrs. Peterson examined everything with meticulous attention, occasionally asking questions about methodology or curriculum. Finally, she nodded. "You know your business, Miss Moore. I'll grant you that. But I need to understand your intentions here. Pine Hollow may be small, but we look after our own. If you're here to take advantage of Caleb's situation or to harm that little girl in any way, I would never harm Lila. I'm here because she needs an education, and I'm qualified to provide one. That's the extent of my intentions." "And the extent of Caleb's intentions? Forgive my bluntness, but a young woman living on a widower's property, teaching his daughter, people will talk. Are you engaged to be married?" "No." "Planning to be?" "No. Mr. Grant has made it very clear that our arrangement is purely professional. I'm a teacher, he's my employer, nothing more." Mrs. Peterson studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I believe you, though whether Caleb believes it himself is another matter entirely. That man's been alone too long, and loneliness does strange things to people's judgment." She stayed for another hour, drinking tea and interrogating Lila about her lessons. The girl performed beautifully, demonstrating her knowledge with such pride that even Caleb, watching from the doorway, couldn't hide his pleased expression. Before she left, Mrs. Peterson pulled Evelyn aside. "You seem genuine, Miss Moore, and that child is thriving in ways I haven't seen since her mother died. But be careful. Caleb's built walls around his heart so high that even his own daughter can barely scale them sometimes. Don't mistake his acceptance of your teaching for anything deeper, and don't let yourself hope for more than what's been offered." "I won't," Evelyn promised, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Mrs. Peterson left, and life returned to its rhythm. But something had shifted. The visit had made their arrangement feel more real, more public. People in town would know about Evelyn now. They would watch and judge and gossip. The pressure of outside eyes added weight to what had been, until now, a private arrangement. That night, after Lila had gone to bed, Caleb approached Evelyn as she was preparing to return to the barn. "I think we should tell Lila about the winter arrangement," he said without preamble. "The week's almost up, and she'll be distraught if she thinks you're leaving. Better to tell her now that you're staying longer." "Are you certain? We agreed to wait until the week was complete." "I'm certain. You've proven yourself these past days. Lila's learning more than I could have taught her in years. And—" he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You've been good for her in other ways, too. She laughs more, talks more, seems lighter somehow. She's a remarkable child, Caleb. You've done well with her. I've kept her alive. You're teaching her to actually live. There's a difference." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or fatigue or both. "We'll tell her tomorrow morning. Together, so she understands the terms clearly. This is a winter arrangement only. Come spring, we reassess. I don't want her thinking this is permanent." "I understand." But the next morning, before they could share their news, everything changed. They were just finishing breakfast when horses approached, multiple horses, moving fast. Caleb's head snapped up, his body going tense with instant wariness. Through the window, Evelyn saw 3 riders, one of them wearing a dark suit despite the rural setting, official-looking, threatening in their formality. "Lila, go to your loft," Caleb ordered, his voice sharp. "Now." "But Papa, now!" The girl scrambled up the ladder, fear clear on her face. Evelyn moved to follow her, to offer comfort, but Caleb caught her arm. "Stay. You're part of this household now. You should hear whatever they've come to say." He opened the door before the visitors could knock, stepping out onto the porch with the solid presence of a man defending his territory. The suited man dismounted, flanked by 2 larger men who looked like hired muscle. Up close, Evelyn could see official papers clutched in the suited man's hand and her stomach clenched with foreboding. "Caleb Grant?" the suited man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That's right. Who's asking?" "My name is Raymond Thatcher. I'm an attorney from Cheyenne." He held up the papers. "I represent the estate of Sarah Grant, née Colburn. Specifically, I represent Mrs. Helen Colburn, Sarah's mother and Lila Grant's maternal grandmother." The color drained from Caleb's face. "Helen Colburn has no claim on my daughter." "I'm afraid she disagrees. Mrs. Colburn has filed a petition with the territorial court requesting custody of her granddaughter. She argues that a child being raised in isolation by a single father without proper education or female guidance is being neglected. She wishes to provide Lila with the advantages of city life, proper schooling, and appropriate supervision." "Neglected?" Caleb's voice was dangerous now, trembling with barely controlled rage. "My daughter is loved and cared for. She has everything she needs." "Does she attend school?" "She's being educated at home." "By you? A carpenter with minimal formal education?" Thatcher's tone was dismissive, cruelly efficient. "Mrs. Colburn has documentation showing that you rarely bring the child to town, that she has no social interaction with other children, that she's being raised in conditions far below what her mother's family could provide. The court is inclined to agree that a change of custody would be in the child's best interest." Evelyn stepped forward before she could stop herself. "That's not true. Lila is receiving an excellent education. I'm her teacher. I was employed at Miss Pritchard's school for young ladies in Philadelphia before coming here. I can provide documentation of my credentials." Thatcher's cold gaze swept over her. "And you are?" "Miss Evelyn Moore. I've been engaged by Mr. Grant to educate his daughter." "For how long?" "Since—" Evelyn glanced at Caleb, making a split-second decision. "Since early summer. I've been working with Lila for months now." It was a lie, but a necessary one. If Thatcher knew she'd only been here a few days, it would support his argument that Caleb had scrambled to find a teacher only after legal action had been threatened. "I see." Thatcher made a note on his papers. "And you reside where exactly?" "On the property. Inappropriate quarters, naturally. Naturally. His skepticism was palpable. Mr. Grant, regardless of recent changes to your household, the court date is set for 2 weeks from today in Pine Hollow. Judge Morrison will hear arguments from both sides and make a determination about Lila's future. Mrs. Colburn will be arriving from Cheyenne with character witnesses and documentation of her suitability as a guardian. I suggest you obtain legal representation and prepare your defense. Good day. He remounted, and the three men rode away, leaving silence in their wake. Caleb stood frozen on the porch, his face ashen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. From inside the cabin came a small, broken sound, Lila crying. Evelyn moved past Caleb and found the girl huddled in the corner of her loft, her face buried in her arms. Lila, sweetheart, they're going to take me away. The words were muffled, but audible. That lawyer man, he's going to make me go live with Grandmother Colburn, and I'll never see Papa again. That's not going to happen. We won't let it happen. How can we stop them? They have a judge and lawyers and everything. Lila looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild with terror. I don't even know Grandmother Colburn. Mama never talked about her. Why does she want me now? Evelyn had no good answer to that question. Instead, she gathered the trembling child into her arms and held her while she sobbed. Below, she could hear Caleb pacing, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The sound of a man trapped, desperate, searching for solutions that didn't exist. After a while, Lila cried herself out and fell into exhausted sleep. Evelyn climbed down from the loft to find Caleb sitting at the table, his head in his hands, looking more defeated than she'd thought possible. Caleb, don't. His voice was raw. Don't tell me it'll be fine. Don't tell me we'll fight this. I know what this is. Helen Colburn has money, influence, everything I don't have. She can give Lila tutors and music lessons and fancy dresses. What can I give her? A cabin in the woods and a father who barely speaks? You can give her love, stability, a home where she's wanted for herself, not as some prize to be claimed. That won't matter to a judge. They'll look at what she wrote, that Lila's isolated, uneducated, neglected, and they'll look at me, a widower barely making ends meet, no wife to help raise her, working all hours just to survive. Then they'll look at Helen Colburn, wealthy widow, fine house in Cheyenne, respectable position in society. Who would you choose? I'd choose the parent who actually loves the child. Love doesn't pay for schooling or dresses or a future. He looked up at her then, and his eyes were haunted. Sarah begged me, before she died, made me promise I'd never let her mother have Lila. Helen Colburn is a cold, controlling woman who made Sarah's life miserable. That's why we left Cheyenne, why we came to the middle of nowhere to start over. Sarah wanted our daughter raised free, not shaped into some society ornament, and now I'm going to break that promise because I'm not enough to keep her safe. You are enough, and you're not alone in this fight. Evelyn sat down across from him, forcing him to meet her eyes. Tell me about Helen Colburn. Why didn't she fight for custody before now? She didn't know Lila existed. Sarah and I eloped against her mother's wishes. She'd wanted Sarah to marry some wealthy merchant. When Sarah wrote telling her we were married and expecting, Helen sent back a letter disowning her, said she had no daughter anymore. So we never contacted her again, even after Sarah died. I thought... His voice broke. I thought she didn't care. Then something changed. Something made her decide to pursue custody now, after 7 years of absence. I don't know what. Unless, Caleb frowned, thinking, unless someone from Pine Hollow wrote to her, told her about our situation, maybe thinking they were helping. Who would do that? I don't know. But whoever it was, they've destroyed us. How do I fight this, Evelyn? I can't afford a lawyer. I don't know anyone with influence who'd speak for me. And even if I could prove Lila's being educated now, they'll say it's too little, too late. Evelyn's mind raced, sorting through possibilities, searching for strategies. She'd grown up watching her father, a lawyer, prepare cases, argue before judges, build defenses from fragments of truth and procedure. The knowledge was old, maybe unreliable, but it was all they had. The court date is in 2 weeks. That gives us time to build a case. First, we document everything about Lila's education, her progress, her curriculum, her advanced abilities. We show that she's not neglected, but thriving. Second, we find character witnesses who'll testify to your fitness as a father. Third, we research Helen Colburn's background, find any weakness in her claim that we can exploit. That's a lot to do in 2 weeks. Then we better start now. She stood, pacing, her teacher's mind organizing information into manageable pieces. Mrs. Peterson, would she testify for you? Maybe. She's known us since we arrived, seen how I've raised Lila. Sheriff Turner? Possibly. He's never had cause to question my parenting. Who else? Who in town knows you well enough to speak to your character? Caleb listed several names. The owner of the general store where he sold his furniture, the minister who'd buried Sarah, a few customers who'd commissioned large pieces and had visited the property. It wasn't much, but it was something. And we need to show the court that Lila has stability here. Not just education, but a proper home environment with appropriate female guidance. Evelyn paused, an idea forming. What if we told them we're engaged? What? Not truly engaged, but if we presented ourselves as planning to marry, it would address their concerns about you raising a daughter alone. It would show that Lila has a maternal figure in her life, that there's stability and respectability in her home situation. Caleb stared at her as if she'd suggested something obscene. You want us to lie to a court? I want us to present the best possible case for keeping Lila with her father. And the truth is, I am here providing maternal guidance and education. The only difference between our actual situation and an engagement is a future promise of marriage. We don't have to actually marry. We just need to convince the judge that we're planning to. And after the hearing? When people expect a wedding that never happens? We'll deal with that when the time comes. Right now, we focus on keeping Lila safe. Caleb was silent for a long time, wrestling with the proposition. Finally, he said, I won't ask you to perjure yourself for us. This is my battle, my failure. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. This stopped being just your battle the moment Lila grabbed me in that clearing and begged me not to leave. I care about that child, Caleb. I won't stand by and watch her be taken from the only home she's ever known. Why? The question was raw, vulnerable. Why do you care so much? You barely know us. Because I understand what it feels like to be taken from everything you know and love. My parents died when I was 19, and suddenly I had nothing. No home, no family, no anchor in the world. I survived, but I remember the terror of it. And I won't let Lila experience that if there's anything I can do to prevent it. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. If we do this, if we claim to be engaged, it has to be convincing. Judges aren't fools. They'll ask questions, look for inconsistencies. Then we prepare our story carefully. We make sure every detail aligns. Evelyn sat back down, pulling paper toward her. When did we meet? When did you propose? What are our plans for the future? We need answers to all of it. They spent the next hour constructing their fiction, building a courtship that never happened, creating a future they had no intention of pursuing. It felt dishonest and desperate and necessary all at once. By the time they finished, the story was plausible. Caleb had advertised for a teacher, Evelyn had responded, they'd corresponded for months before she arrived. Upon her arrival, they'd discovered a connection deeper than employer and employee. A proposal had followed, quiet and simple, suitable for two practical people building a life together. It sounds almost real when you tell it like that, Caleb said quietly. The best lies always contain elements of truth. A sound from the loft reminded them that Lila was still there, still listening, still absorbing everything. Caleb called up to her. Lila Bug, come down here. We need to talk. The girl climbed down slowly, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She looked between them with such fragile hope that Evelyn's heart ached. Are you really going to pretend to be engaged? Lila asked. I heard everything. We're considering it, Caleb said carefully. But only if you understand what it means. It would be pretend, Lila, for the judge to help us keep you here. It wouldn't be real. But it could become real. Lila's voice was small but insistent. Couldn't it? If you pretended long enough, maybe you'd stop pretending and start meaning it. Lila, that's not... I know it's not guaranteed, Papa. I'm not stupid, but it could happen. And even if it doesn't, even if it's pretend forever, at least I get to stay with you. At least I don't have to go live with a grandmother who never wanted Mama and probably doesn't really want me either. The blunt wisdom of children. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Caleb and saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. How did they explain to a 7-year-old the complexities of adult deception, the dangers of false hope, the probability of future heartbreak? "We'll do what we must to keep you safe," Caleb said finally. "But Lila, you have to promise me something. You have to promise you won't build dreams on top of our pretending. Miss Evelyn is helping us because she's kind, not because she wants to be your mother or my wife. When this is over, things might go back to how they were before. You need to be prepared for that." "I promise I'll try." It was the best Lila could offer, and they all knew it was probably a lie. But what choice did they have? The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Evelyn worked with Lila for hours each day, documenting every lesson, every advancement, creating a portfolio of work that would demonstrate exceptional progress. Caleb rode to town and spoke with potential witnesses, coming back each evening with reports. Some people willing to testify, others hesitant to get involved in legal matters, a few outright refusing. Sheriff Turner agreed to speak on Caleb's behalf, attesting to his character and his care of Lila. Mrs. Peterson not only agreed, but offered to help coordinate other witnesses. The minister who'd conducted Sarah's funeral was elderly and frail, but promised to write a letter if he couldn't attend in person. But there were setbacks too. The general store owner, though sympathetic, feared antagonizing influential customers from Cheyenne. One of Caleb's best customers, a rancher named Morrison, turned out to be related to the judge and refused to get involved. Each rejection felt like another nail in their case's coffin. 6 days before the hearing, Caleb received a letter. It came by special courier, expensive paper with elegant script, and Evelyn knew before he opened it that it was from Helen Colburn. Caleb read it in silence, his face growing darker with each line. Finally, he handed it to Evelyn without comment. The letter was coldly formal, addressing Caleb as Mr. Grant rather than by his first name, referring to Lila as my granddaughter and Sarah's daughter, but never by name. It outlined Mrs. Colburn's intentions: to provide Lila with every advantage, to honor Sarah's memory by giving her daughter the refined upbringing Sarah herself had received, to correct the mistakes of a hasty marriage and isolated life. It was perfectly worded, carefully constructed to sound generous while being fundamentally cruel. "She never mentions Sarah wanting to be free of her," Evelyn observed. "Never acknowledges that her daughter chose to leave, chose this life with you. Because in Helen's mind, Sarah didn't choose. I took her away, corrupted her, led her astray. That's what she believed then, and that's what she believes now." Caleb took the letter back, staring at it as if it might burst into flames. "She writes about honoring Sarah's memory, but she disowned Sarah while she was alive. Now that Sarah's gone and can't fight back, suddenly Helen wants to claim her legacy. We'll use that. We'll show the judge that Mrs. Colburn's claim is about control and pride, not love." "Will we?" Because from where I'm standing, her argument sounds pretty compelling. She can give Lila everything I can't: education, society, opportunity. What father wouldn't want that for his daughter? A father who knows his daughter would rather have love than opportunity. A father who understands that a gilded cage is still a cage. But Evelyn could hear the doubt creeping into Caleb's voice, see the despair settling over him like fog. Each day brought them closer to the hearing, and each day seemed to reveal new obstacles, new weaknesses in their position. 3 days before the hearing, Lila disappeared. Evelyn discovered her absence during morning lessons. When the girl didn't appear at her usual time, Evelyn assumed she was still sleeping and went to wake her. The loft was empty, Lila's few belongings undisturbed, but the child herself gone. A quick search of the cabin revealed nothing. "Caleb!" Evelyn ran to the workshop, her heart hammering. "Lila's not here. She's not in the cabin or the barn. I can't find her anywhere." The color drained from his face. He dropped his tools immediately, already moving toward the house. "Did you check the creek? She likes to play there sometimes." They searched together, calling Lila's name, their voices growing more desperate with each unanswered cry. The creek yielded nothing. The barn, the smokehouse, The root cellar, all empty. It was as if the child had simply vanished into the morning mist. She ran away. Caleb's voice was hollow. She's so scared of being taken that she ran away. We'll find her. She can't have gone far. She's 8 years old and on foot. You don't know these woods. A child could get lost 20 feet from home and wander for days. And with winter coming, if she's out there overnight... He couldn't finish the thought. They organized a search, Caleb taking the northern woods while Evelyn searched south toward town. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, the temperature rising but not enough to ward off the chill of fear. Evelyn called Lila's name until her throat was raw, pushed through brush that tore at her skirts, followed every trail and game path she could find. It was Sheriff Turner riding out to check on them, who found her. He brought her back draped across his saddle, not unconscious but eerily quiet, wrapped in his coat. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her dress torn, her hands scraped and bleeding. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Caleb caught her as Turner lowered her down, holding her so tightly Evelyn feared he might break her. "Lila Bug, what were you thinking? You could have died out there. You could have—" "I'm sorry, Papa." Her voice was small, muffled against his chest. "I just wanted to find a place where they couldn't take me. Somewhere safe where we could all hide until the judge forgot about us." "There's no such place, baby. No hiding from this." "Then what do we do? How do we stop them?" She looked up at him with such desperate trust, such certainty that her father would have answers, that Evelyn had to look away from the weight of it. "We fight. We go to that hearing and we fight with everything we have. And if that's not enough," his voice broke. "If that's not enough, then at least we'll know we tried." Sheriff Turner dismounted, his expression grave. "Caleb, I need to talk to you, privately." They moved away, speaking in low tones, while Evelyn took Lila inside to clean her wounds and change her clothes. The girl was quiet now, all the fire drained out of her, replaced with a resigned sort of sadness that was infinitely worse. "I heard them talking, you and Papa," Lila said as Evelyn washed the scratches on her hands. "About pretending to be engaged, about building a case. But what if it's not enough? What if the judge decides I have to go anyway? Then we'll appeal. We'll find another way. There won't be time. Once they take me, I'll be in Cheyenne. Papa won't be able to afford to come get me, and Grandmother Colburn will make sure I forget about him, forget about this place, forget about everything I love." Tears spilled down her cheeks again. "I don't want to forget, Miss Evelyn. I don't want to be someone different. I want to stay me, stay here, stay with Papa and you and everything that matters." Evelyn gathered the child close, holding her while she cried, making promises she had no right to make. "You won't forget. No matter what happens, you'll always remember who you are and where you came from. I swear it." When Caleb returned, his face was set in grim lines. Turner brought news. Helen Colburn arrived in Pine Hollow this morning. She's staying at the hotel, and she brought a lawyer from Cheyenne plus 3 character witnesses. She's also requesting that Lila be brought to her at the hotel for a formal meeting before the hearing. "No." The word came out sharper than Evelyn intended. "Absolutely not. She gave up her right to access when she disowned Sarah. She doesn't get to see Lila until the judge rules. Turner agrees with you, and he'll inform Mrs. Colburn of that decision, but it means we're making an enemy of her before the hearing even starts. Better an enemy who respects our boundaries than a friend who tramples them." That night, none of them slept well. Lila tossed and cried out in her dreams, calling for her father. Caleb sat by the fire through the dark hours, staring into the flames. And Evelyn lay in her barn room, listening to the horses breathe and wondering if 2 weeks ago, when she'd stepped off that train full of hope and expectation, she could have imagined ending up here, entangled in a desperate legal battle for a child who wasn't hers, preparing to lie under oath for a man she barely knew, willing to risk everything for a family she'd had no part in building. The answer, she knew, was no. But somehow, impossibly, this had become her fight too. And she would see it through to whatever end awaited them. Dawn broke cold and merciless on the day of the hearing. Evelyn woke before first light, her stomach churning with anxiety, and dressed in her finest remaining outfit, the dark blue traveling suit she'd worn the day she arrived. It felt like a lifetime ago, that moment on the platform when she'd stood alone and unwanted. Now she was preparing to stand before a judge, and fight for a family that wasn't hers, but somehow had become everything. In the cabin, Caleb was already awake, wearing his only good suit, the one he'd been married in, judging by how carefully he handled it, as if touching fabric that held memories too precious to disturb. He'd shaved and combed his hair, looking almost civilized despite the exhaustion shadowing his eyes. Lila sat at the table in a dress Mrs. Peterson had brought over the day before. Cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar, far finer than anything else the girl owned. She looked small and fragile in it, like a doll dressed up for display, and Evelyn's heart clenched at the sight. "Come here, sweetheart," Evelyn said softly. "Let me fix your hair." She braided Lila's long brown hair with care, weaving in a ribbon that matched the dress, trying to keep her hands steady despite their trembling. Lila sat perfectly still, her face solemn, looking far older than her 8 years. "Miss Evelyn?" The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens if we lose?" Evelyn's hands paused mid-braid. She glanced at Caleb, who'd stopped buttoning his vest to listen. The question hung between them, terrible in its simplicity. "We won't lose," Evelyn said, but the words felt hollow. "But what if we do? Will I ever see you and Papa again?" Caleb crossed the room and knelt before his daughter, taking her small hands in his work-roughened ones. "Lilabug, listen to me. No matter what happens today, I am your father. That doesn't change. Courts can't change that, judges can't change that, and Helen Colburn certainly can't change that. If the worst happens, I will find a way to see you. I will never stop fighting to bring you home. Do you understand? But what if she makes me forget you? What if she turns me into someone different, someone who doesn't want to come home?" "That's impossible." He cupped her face, his eyes fierce with certainty. "You know why? Because you're Sarah's daughter as much as mine. You have her strength, her stubbornness, her fire. Your grandmother tried to control Sarah, tried to make her into something she wasn't, and Sarah fought back. She chose her own path, chose me, chose this life. You have that same courage in you. No one can take that away." Lila threw her arms around her father's neck, and he held her for a long moment while Evelyn finished the braid through blurred vision, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to fall. They ate a silent breakfast none of them wanted, then loaded into the wagon Caleb had borrowed from the Petersons. The ride to town felt both endless and too short. Every turn of the wheels brought them closer to a moment that would determine their entire future, and Evelyn found herself memorizing details: the way morning light filtered through the pines, the sound of Lila's quiet breathing beside her, the set of Caleb's shoulders as he drove, tense with the weight of what was coming. Pine Hollow's courthouse was a modest building near the center of town, its white paint fresh, its steps swept clean. A small crowd had already gathered, curious townspeople drawn by gossip, a few who'd come to support Caleb, others who'd come to see the drama unfold. Evelyn spotted Mrs. Peterson near the door, flanked by 2 other ranch wives. Sheriff Turner stood on the steps, his presence official and reassuring, and there, standing apart from everyone else, was Helen Colburn. Evelyn recognized her immediately, though they'd never met. She was a tall woman in her 60s, dressed in expensive black silk that spoke of wealth and mourning, both. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, her mouth set in a line of perpetual disapproval. She stood with perfect posture, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your right to control the world around you. Beside her stood Raymond Thatcher, the lawyer, and 3 well-dressed individuals who must be her character witnesses. They formed a united front, formidable in their certainty. Helen's gaze found Lila immediately, and something complicated moved across her face. Hunger, perhaps, or recognition, or the ghost of old grief. She took a step forward, but Sheriff Turner moved to intercept. "Mrs. Colburn, you'll have your chance to speak during the hearing. Until then, I'll ask you to maintain distance from the child." "That child is my granddaughter. I have every right." "You have the rights the judge grants you, ma'am. No more, no less." Helen's mouth tightened, but she stepped back, her eyes never leaving Lila. The girl pressed closer to Caleb's side, her hand finding Evelyn's and gripping it with desperate strength. "That's her?" Lila whispered. "That's Grandmother Colburn?" "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "She looks like Mama, in the picture you have." It was true. Evelyn could see it now, the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. Sarah must have looked like her mother, which meant Helen was looking at a living ghost of the daughter she'd lost through pride and stubbornness. They climbed the courthouse steps and entered the building. Inside, the main courtroom was small but well-appointed, with wooden pews for observers and a judge's bench at the front. A large window behind the bench let in morning light that seemed too bright for the gravity of what was about to unfold. Judge Morrison was already present, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years on the frontier before taking up law. He looked up as they entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Grant, I presume? And Mrs. Colburn, please take your seats. We'll begin shortly." The next few minutes were a blur of procedure, swearing in, introductions, the judge explaining the format of the hearing. Evelyn sat in the front pew with Lila between her and Caleb, acutely aware of Helen Colburn's presence across the aisle, of the woman's eyes constantly returning to the granddaughter she'd never met. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order and looked at Thatcher. "Counselor, you may present Mrs. Colburn's petition." Thatcher stood, and his opening statement was devastatingly effective. He painted a picture of Lila as an isolated, neglected child living in poverty, with a father too consumed by grief and work to properly care for her. He described Helen Colburn's mansion in Cheyenne, her social standing, her ability to provide the finest education, the most refined upbringing. He presented letters from Cheyenne residents attesting to Mrs. Colburn's character, her involvement in charitable works, her longing to honor her late daughter by caring for Sarah's child. "Mrs. Colburn doesn't seek to replace Mr. Grant as Lila's parent," Thatcher concluded. "She seeks to supplement his care with the advantages only she can provide. A child deserves every opportunity, Your Honor. Mrs. Colburn can offer opportunities Mr. Grant, through no fault of his own, simply cannot match." It was perfectly done, reasonable and compassionate in tone, while being fundamentally ruthless in intent. Evelyn watched Caleb's hands clench on his knees, saw the despair creeping across his face. Judge Morrison turned to Caleb. "Mr. Grant, as you have no legal representation, you may speak for yourself. What is your response to Mrs. Colburn's petition?" Caleb stood, and for a moment Evelyn feared he might simply concede defeat. He looked at Lila, then at the judge, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "Your Honor, I won't pretend I can give my daughter everything Mrs. Colburn can. I'm not wealthy. I work with my hands, live simply, and raise Lila in a cabin 3 miles from town. But she is loved. She is wanted. She is cherished every single day of her life. Her mother died bringing her into this world, and with her last breath, Sarah made me promise I'd keep our daughter safe from the kind of control she herself escaped. Mrs. Colburn disowned Sarah for choosing me, for choosing freedom over society. Now she wants to claim the child she never acknowledged while Sarah was alive. That's not love, Your Honor. That's possession." "You claim the child is loved," Judge Morrison said. "Yet Mr. Thatcher's investigation suggests she receives no formal education, has no contact with other children, and lives in isolation that some might consider harmful to her development." "Those things were true," Caleb admitted. "Until recently, but circumstances have changed." He gestured to Evelyn. "This is Miss Evelyn Moore, my fiancée and Lila's teacher. She's been providing my daughter with an exceptional education for the past several months." The lie came smoothly, and Evelyn stood to support it, moving to Caleb's side with what she hoped looked like natural affection. "Miss Moore," the judge said, studying her, "you are a teacher by profession?" "Yes, Your Honor. I was employed at Miss Pritchard's School for Young Ladies in Philadelphia for 6 years before coming west." She'd prepared for this, had her credentials ready. "I can provide documentation of my qualifications and examples of Lila's work if you'd like to examine them." "I would indeed." Evelyn presented the portfolio they'd assembled, samples of Lila's writing, her arithmetic work, her drawings for geography lessons, her essays on history. The judge examined each page carefully while the courtroom waited in tense silence. "This is impressive work," he admitted, "particularly for a child of 8. Miss Moore, how long have you been working with Lila?" Here was the dangerous moment, the lie they had to maintain. "Since early summer, Your Honor, Mr. Grant and I corresponded for some time before I traveled west. Once I arrived and began teaching Lila, we discovered our connection went beyond a professional arrangement. How convenient, Thatcher interjected. A teacher appears precisely when Mr. Grant faces legal action regarding his daughter's education. Your Honor, I submit that this is a transparent attempt to address neglect only after being caught. Miss Moore arrived months before any legal action was initiated, Caleb said sharply. We had no knowledge of Mrs. Colburn's intentions until 2 weeks ago. Can you prove Miss Moore's presence before then? Do you have witnesses who can attest to seeing her at your property prior to the legal notice? The question hung like a blade. They had no such witnesses because Evelyn had only been there 2 weeks. But before the silence could damn them, Mrs. Peterson stood in the gallery. I can attest to it, Your Honor. Every head turned toward her. The judge raised his eyebrows. Mrs. Margaret Peterson, is it? You're willing to testify? I am. I visited the Grant property regularly over the years, bringing supplies and checking on Lila. I first met Miss Moore in July when I stopped by and found her teaching Lila mathematics on the porch. We had a pleasant conversation about education methods, and I've seen her there on multiple occasions since. It was a blatant lie, told with such calm certainty that even Evelyn almost believed it. Mrs. Peterson's eyes met hers briefly, and Evelyn saw the fierce determination there. This woman would perjure herself to protect a child she cared about. Thatcher looked furious but couldn't directly challenge a witness's testimony without evidence. Even accepting Miss Moore's presence, he said tightly, the question remains whether Mr. Grant can provide appropriate guidance for a young girl. A child needs a mother's influence, stable female companionship. Which she'll have, Caleb interrupted. Miss Moore and I are engaged to be married. She'll be Lila's stepmother. When is this wedding planned? Spring, Evelyn said smoothly. After the winter weather passes. We're practical people, Your Honor. A winter wedding in Wyoming territory would be difficult for guests to attend. Judge Morrison leaned back, considering. Miss Moore, this is a serious undertaking. You're prepared to marry Mr. Grant and assume responsibility for his daughter? I am, Your Honor. I've come to love both of them dearly. The words weren't entirely false. She did care about them, had come to care more than she'd expected. The emotion in her voice was real, even if the engagement wasn't. And you, Mr. Grant, you're prepared to marry Miss Moore. Caleb looked at Evelyn, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of the lie they were building, but also something deeper, something unspoken. Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn is everything I could want for myself and for my daughter. The judge made notes, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Helen Colburn. Mrs. Colburn, do you wish to address the court? The older woman stood with regal composure. When she spoke, her voice was cultured, controlled, devastating in its reasonableness. Your Honor, I bear no ill will toward Mr. Grant. I'm certain he loves his daughter in his fashion, but love alone doesn't prepare a child for the world. My daughter Sarah was raised with every advantage: education, culture, refinement. She knew music and literature, spoke French, moved with grace in society. Those weren't frivolous accomplishments. They were tools that would have opened every door, ensured her success regardless of her circumstances. When she chose to abandon those advantages for a carpenter's cabin in the wilderness, I was devastated. I expressed my disapproval harshly, and I regret that. But I never stopped loving my daughter, and I never stopped hoping she'd come to her senses. She paused, and genuine emotion cracked through her composure. Sarah died before we could reconcile. I've lived with that grief for 8 years, but I have a chance now to honor her memory by ensuring her daughter doesn't suffer the same limitations Sarah chose to impose on herself. Lila deserves to know the world beyond these woods. She deserves to develop her obvious intelligence in the finest schools, to learn grace and culture, to have every opportunity I gave Sarah. Keeping her here, however much she's loved, is a form of imprisonment. It was powerfully said, and Evelyn could see it landing with the judge. Helen Colburn wasn't a villain. She was a mother who'd lost her daughter and genuinely believed she was fighting for her granddaughter's best interests. That made her far more dangerous than simple malice would have been. Your Honor, Evelyn said before she could stop herself. May I speak? Judge Morrison looked surprised but nodded. Briefly, Miss Moore. Mrs. Colburn speaks of opportunities and advantages, and I don't doubt she could provide them. But there's one thing she hasn't mentioned: what Lila wants. That child has a voice, has preferences, has feelings about her own future. Shouldn't those be considered? Miss Moore, an 8-year-old child lacks the maturity to make such decisions. That's why adults make them for her. But surely her feelings should weigh in the balance. If she's terrified of leaving her father, miserable at the thought of being taken from her home, doesn't that matter? Of course it matters, but children often resist what's best for them. They prefer candy to vegetables, play to study. We don't let children dictate their own upbringing. This isn't about candy versus vegetables, Your Honor. This is about taking a child from the only parent she's ever known and giving her to a stranger who disowned her mother. That's not what's best for her. That's what's convenient for someone else's conscience. Miss Moore, the judge said sternly, you're approaching contempt. Sit down. Evelyn sat, her heart hammering, knowing she'd gone too far but unable to regret it. Beside her, Lila was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, and Caleb had his arm around her shoulders, holding her together. The judge called several witnesses. Sheriff Turner testified to Caleb's character, describing him as hardworking and devoted to his daughter. Mrs. Peterson spoke about Lila's care and happiness. The general store owner confirmed that Caleb always paid his debts and conducted himself honorably. But Thatcher countered with his own witnesses. A banker from Cheyenne who described Helen Colburn's substantial wealth and charitable works. A headmistress from a prestigious girls' school who spoke about the education Lila could receive there. A doctor who testified that raising a child in isolation could cause psychological harm. By midday, the testimony was complete. Judge Morrison announced he would take a short recess to consider the evidence before rendering his decision. The courtroom emptied into the corridor, people clustering in nervous groups. Caleb stood apart with Lila, the girl pressed against his side, both of them silent. Evelyn joined them, and they formed a small circle of shared dread. Whatever happens, Caleb said quietly, speaking to both of them, I need you to know I'm grateful. Evelyn, you've sacrificed your reputation, possibly opened yourself to legal consequences, all for a child who isn't yours. I'll never forget that. And Lila, his voice broke. Lila Bug, you are the best thing I've ever done, the only thing that matters. No judge can change that. Papa, I don't want to go. Please don't let them take me. Please. I'm trying, baby. I promise I'm trying. Across the corridor, Helen Colburn stood with her entourage, occasionally glancing their way with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Finally, the older woman approached, her steps careful, controlled. Mr. Grant, she said formally, might I have a word? I don't think that's appropriate, Mrs. Colburn. Please, just a moment, in private. Caleb looked at Evelyn, who nodded slightly. He followed Helen to a quiet corner, leaving Evelyn with Lila. They watched the conversation from a distance, saw Helen speaking, Caleb listening with increasing anger, then Helen saying something that made him go very still. The discussion lasted perhaps 5 minutes before Caleb returned, his face ashen. What did she say? Evelyn asked. She offered me money, $10,000 to voluntarily surrender custody. She said I could use it to expand my business, secure my own future. Said it would be cleaner than forcing the judge to rule, kinder to Lila than a public rejection of my fitness as a father. His hands were shaking. She actually thought I might take it, thought I could be bought. What did you tell her? That I'd burn in hell before I sold my daughter. A clerk appeared, announcing the judge was ready to deliver his decision. They filed back into the courtroom, taking their seats, and the weight of anticipation was almost unbearable. Judge Morrison entered, holding a single sheet of paper, his face grave. I've given this matter careful consideration, he began. Both parties present compelling arguments. Mrs. Colburn can indeed provide advantages Mr. Grant cannot match. However, Mr. Grant demonstrates genuine love and commitment to his daughter, and recent improvements to Lila's circumstances, particularly regarding her education, show his willingness to adapt and meet her needs. He paused, and in that silence, Evelyn felt the future balance on a knife's edge. The question before me is not which parent can provide the most advantageous circumstances, but which can provide the best home. Those are not always the same thing. After careful consideration, I find that the courtroom door burst open. Everyone turned as a small figure ran down the aisle. Lila, who'd somehow slipped away from Caleb's side. She ran straight to the judge's bench, her voice ringing clear despite her tears. "Your Honor, please, please listen to me. I know I'm just a child, and you said children don't get to choose, but this is my life, and I should have some say in it, shouldn't I? I don't want to go to Cheyenne. I don't want to live with Grandmother Colburn. I know she can give me nice dresses and fancy schools, but I don't care about those things. I care about Papa. I care about Miss Evelyn. I care about our cabin and our woods and everything that's mine, really mine, not just things someone else thinks I should want." "Young lady," the judge began, but Lila continued, the words pouring out in a desperate flood. "Papa said Mama chose him even though Grandmother Colburn didn't approve. Mama chose love over advantages. If you take me away from Papa, you're saying Mama's choice was wrong. You're saying love doesn't matter as much as money and education and all those other things, but it does matter. Love matters most, and I love my Papa more than anything in the world. Please don't take me away from him. Please." She was sobbing now, her small body shaking. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Helen Colburn had tears on her cheeks, though whether from sympathy or recognition of the daughter she'd lost, Evelyn couldn't tell. Judge Morrison looked at Lila for a long moment, then at Caleb, then at Helen. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Grant, Miss Grant, return to your father, please." Lila ran back to Caleb, who caught her up and held her fiercely. The judge cleared his throat. "In my years on the bench, I've seen many custody cases. Usually, they involve clear neglect or abuse. This case is different. This involves two parties who both genuinely believe they're acting in the child's best interest. But that child just demonstrated remarkable courage and clarity. She knows her own mind, and she's chosen her home." He looked directly at Helen. "Mrs. Colburn, I cannot ignore the fact that you disowned your daughter when she chose a path different from the one you wanted for her. Now you seek to control her daughter's path in the same way. Your intentions may be pure, but your history suggests a pattern of demanding conformity over accepting individual choice. Sarah Grant chose her life with full awareness of what she was giving up. Her daughter deserves the same freedom." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Grant, your circumstances have improved significantly with Miss Moore's presence. Your daughter is receiving an education, she has female guidance, and you've demonstrated willingness to adapt to meet her needs. However, I'm troubled by how recently these changes occurred. I question whether they're genuine or merely convenient responses to legal pressure." Evelyn's heart sank. He was going to rule against them despite everything. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I'm issuing a conditional ruling. Custody remains with Mr. Grant, but with stipulations. First, Lila's education must continue at the current level or improve. I want quarterly reports from Miss Moore or another qualified teacher. Second, Mrs. Colburn is granted visitation rights, 2 weeks each summer in Cheyenne, to be arranged at mutually agreeable times. This allows Lila to know her grandmother while maintaining her primary home with her father. Third, Mr. Grant and Miss Moore must actually marry within 6 months. If this engagement is merely a convenient fiction to win this case, I'll revisit custody immediately." He struck his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Caleb sat frozen, Lila still in his arms, clearly trying to process what had just happened. They'd won, but at a price. They had to actually get married now, had to make their lie into truth, or lose everything. Helen Colburn stood, her composure shattered, and left the courtroom without a word, her lawyer and witnesses following. Mrs. Peterson hurried over, embracing Lila, murmuring congratulations. Sheriff Turner shook Caleb's hand, relief obvious on his weathered face. But Evelyn could only stare at the judge's bench, at the man who'd just declared she must marry Caleb Grant within 6 months or risk destroying the family she'd fought so hard to protect. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was too bright, too cheerful for the complicated victory they'd achieved. Caleb set Lila down, and the girl immediately threw her arms around Evelyn. "We won! We won! I get to stay!" "Yes, sweetheart, you get to stay. And you're going to marry Papa and be my real mother, not just my pretend one." Evelyn looked over Lila's head at Caleb, who stood silent, his expression unreadable. They'd fought together, lied together, built a case together, but neither had agreed to actually spend their lives together. The engagement had been strategy, not romance. A solution to a legal problem, not a declaration of love. Now the judge had called their bluff, and they had 6 months to decide, make the lie real, or watch everything they'd fought for crumble to dust. Lila, Caleb said quietly, go with Mrs. Peterson for a moment. I need to talk to Miss Evelyn. Alone. The girl reluctantly released Evelyn and went to Mrs. Peterson, who tactfully drew her away. Caleb and Evelyn stood facing each other on the courthouse steps, aware of curious eyes watching, neither quite willing to speak first. Finally, Caleb said, I won't hold you to it. To what? The marriage. The judge's order. You didn't agree to actually marry me. You agreed to pretend, to help us through the hearing. That's done now. I'll find another solution, some way to satisfy the court without forcing you into a marriage you don't want. And if you can't find another solution, if the only way to keep Lila is for us to actually marry, then I'll figure something else out. I won't trap you, Evelyn. You've already sacrificed too much. She should have been relieved. He was offering her an escape, a way to honor her commitment without surrendering her entire future. But standing there, watching Lila laugh at something Mrs. Peterson said, seeing the hope and fear warring in Caleb's eyes, Evelyn realized something she'd been carefully avoiding admitting to herself. She didn't want an escape. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, this had stopped being a temporary arrangement, stopped being simply about teaching or survival or professional obligation. She'd come to care about this broken family, to see herself as part of it, to imagine a future here that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with belonging. What if I said yes? She asked quietly. Caleb went very still. What? What if I agreed to actually marry you? Not because the judge ordered it, but because I choose it. Evelyn, you can't. You don't. He struggled for words, clearly blindsided. You barely know me. I'm difficult and closed off and damaged. I live in the middle of nowhere doing work that barely keeps us fed. I can't give you the life you deserve. And asking you to marry me because a judge said I must is asking you to settle for far less than you're worth. Maybe I'm tired of waiting for what I deserve. Maybe I'm ready to build something with what I have. She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. Caleb, I came west because I had nothing left in Philadelphia. No family, no prospects, no life worth keeping. Then a child wrote me letters and gave me a chance at something different. These past 2 weeks, teaching Lila, being part of your daily life, fighting beside you, it's given me more purpose than 6 years in that school ever did. So when you ask if I'm willing to marry you, the answer is yes. Not because I have to, but because I want to. You want to marry a man you barely know? A widower still in love with a ghost? A father who nearly lost his daughter because he was too proud and broken to ask for help? I want to marry a man who loves his daughter enough to set aside his pride. A carpenter who works himself to exhaustion to provide for his family. A person who's been hurt badly but still finds the courage to try again. She reached for his hand, felt his fingers close around hers with desperate strength. I'm not expecting romance or grand gestures, Caleb. I'm offering partnership. 2 people who need each other, building a life together because it makes sense, because it could be good. Is that really so impossible to accept? He stared at her, and she watched the wall he'd built around himself begin to crack. I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to let someone in again. Sarah's death broke something in me, and I'm not sure I ever healed properly. Then we'll heal together. Slowly, carefully, honestly. No more pretending, no more lies. Just 2 people choosing each other because it's right, because it's what we both need, because there's no one else we'd rather face the world with. And if I'm never the husband you hope for, if I'm always a little broken, a little distant, then I'll love you anyway. Broken pieces and all. The words hung between them, more binding than any legal contract. Caleb's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt or regret or hesitation. Finding none, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like surrender and acceptance both. I'm choosing you, he said against her hair. Not because I have to, but because somewhere in these past 2 weeks, you stopped being a stranger and started being essential. I'm choosing you, Evelyn Moore. If you'll have me, I'll have you, Caleb Grant, broken pieces and all. Lila's delighted shriek interrupted them. The girl came running, throwing herself at them both. wrapping her arms around them as far as they would reach. "Does this mean it's real now? The engagement? You're really going to get married?" Caleb and Evelyn looked at each other over Lila's head, and what passed between them now was different from before. Not strategy or convenience, but genuine choice, genuine hope. "Yes," they said together, "it's real." Mrs. Peterson was crying openly, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. Sheriff Turner grinned and shook Caleb's hand again, harder this time, with the enthusiasm of someone witnessing something unexpected and wonderful. Other townspeople who'd witnessed the hearing approached with congratulations, and suddenly they were surrounded by well-wishers, by people celebrating not just the custody victory, but the unlikely romance that had emerged from crisis. That night, back at the cabin, they sat together by the fire, Caleb, Evelyn, and Lila, and talked about the future they would build. Not the future forced on them by a judge's order, but the one they were choosing together. "Can we have a real wedding?" Lila asked, her eyes shining. "With flowers and cake and everyone we know?" "If that's what you want," Caleb said. And there was a softness in his voice Evelyn had never heard before. The walls were coming down, stone by stone, and behind them was a man capable of gentleness, capable of hope, capable of love, if given time to remember how. "I want Miss Evelyn to have a beautiful dress, and I want to be there, right in front, watching you promise to love each other forever." "Forever is a long time," Evelyn said gently. "But you will, won't you? Love each other forever?" Caleb reached across the space between them and took Evelyn's hand. "I'll try. That's all I can promise. That I'll try every day to be the man you both deserve. And I'll try to be patient while you learn," Evelyn said. "To give you space when you need it, to push when you need pushing, to build this marriage day by day instead of expecting perfection immediately." Lila looked between them, satisfaction clear on her young face. "I picked right," she announced. "When I read all those letters, I knew you were the one, Miss Evelyn. I knew you'd fit with us perfectly. And I was right." Later, after Lila had fallen asleep in her loft, exhausted by emotion and victory both, Caleb walked Evelyn to the barn. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead, and they moved slowly, neither quite ready to separate. "I meant what I said today," Caleb told her, his voice low, "about choosing you. But Evelyn, I need you to understand this won't be easy. I'm not easy. I carry a lot of grief, a lot of anger at the world. Some days I'll be distant or difficult or impossible to reach. Some days I'll look at you and see Sarah, and the pain of that will make me withdraw. You need to know what you're agreeing to. I know you're broken, Caleb. So am I. Everyone is, in their own way. But broken things can be mended, and sometimes they're stronger for having been repaired." She stopped, turning to face him fully. "I'm not asking you to stop loving Sarah. She gave you Lila, gave you years of happiness before tragedy struck. I'd never ask you to forget her or pretend she didn't matter. I'm only asking you to make room for me alongside those memories, to let me in, slowly, in whatever way you can manage." He touched her face, his rough fingers gentle against her cheek. "You're remarkable. Do you know that? Coming all this way for a lie, staying for a child who wasn't yours, fighting for us when you had every reason to leave. I don't know what I did to deserve you walking into our lives, but I'm grateful for it. More grateful than I know how to express. Then express it by letting yourself be happy, by letting Lila see you smile more often, by building a life that honors Sarah's memory without being trapped by it. I'll try. That's all I ask." He kissed her then, tentative and careful, a first kiss that held promise and uncertainty both. When they parted, Evelyn saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Possibility. The faint, fragile beginning of hope. She left him standing in the moonlight and returned to her room in the barn, knowing it wouldn't be her room much longer. Soon she'd move into the cabin properly, would share space and life with this family she'd chosen. The thought was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. As she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about that first day on the platform, when no one had come to meet her, when she'd felt so utterly alone and unwanted. If someone had told her then that in 2 weeks she'd be engaged, preparing to fight for a child's custody, building a life in the Wyoming wilderness, she would have thought them insane. But life had a way of surprising you, of taking detours that led to destinations you'd never imagined. She'd come west looking for a future promised by letters. What she'd found instead was a future built on truth and choice and the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of people choosing each other despite every reason not to. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: planning a wedding, continuing Lila's education, negotiating the summer visits with Helen Colburn, learning to live as a family instead of a temporary arrangement. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Evelyn Moore felt like she'd found her place in the world. Not perfect, not what she'd expected, but real and chosen and hers. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that transformed the clearing into something from a fairy tale. Evelyn woke on a December morning 6 weeks after the hearing to find the world blanketed in white, the pines heavy with it, the air sharp and clean. She'd moved into the cabin 3 weeks earlier, taking the small room that Caleb had partitioned off near the fireplace, giving her privacy while making her officially part of the household. The wedding was planned for Christmas Day, just 2 weeks away. Mrs. Peterson had taken charge of arrangements with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years to see Caleb Grant rejoin the living. The whole town would attend, she'd declared, and anyone who had opinions about the unconventional courtship could keep them to themselves or stay home. Evelyn rose quietly, careful not to wake Lila in the loft above, and found Caleb already at the stove making coffee. This had become their routine, early morning moments together before the day's demands intruded, a time to talk softly or simply exist in companionable silence. "Morning," he said, pouring her a cup. "Sleep well?" "Well enough. You?" "Better than I have in years." He said it simply, as fact rather than declaration, but Evelyn felt the weight of it. Caleb was changing, slowly opening like a flower, too long in shadow, finally finding sun. He smiled more often now, touched her hand when he passed, sometimes even laughed at Lila's jokes. The walls were coming down, and behind them was a man worth knowing. They drank their coffee by the window, watching the snow fall, and Evelyn thought about how strange it was that 6 months ago she'd been in Philadelphia preparing lessons for girls who didn't want to learn them, never imagining that a child's forged letters would bring her here, to this moment, to this life she was building one quiet morning at a time. "Evelyn," Caleb said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about the wedding, about what it means. Having second thoughts?" She kept her voice light, but anxiety flickered in her chest. "No. The opposite, actually." He set down his cup, turning to face her fully. "When we first agreed to this, it was strategy. A way to keep Lila safe. But these past weeks, living with you, watching you with my daughter, learning who you really are, it's become something different for me. Something real." "For me too," she admitted. "I'm not good with words, never have been. But I want you to know that when I stand up in front of that congregation and promise to love you, I'll mean it, not because a judge ordered it, but because somewhere along the way, I started falling for you. The way you challenge me when I'm being stubborn, the way you make Lila laugh, the way you've taken this broken household and made it feel like a home again." He reached for her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I'll never be the romantic hero from one of those novels, but I can promise to honor you, respect you, and do my damnedest to make you happy if you'll let me." Evelyn's throat tightened with emotion. "Caleb Grant, if you'd said something like that 3 months ago when I stepped off that train, I would have thought you impossibly perfect and probably too good to be true. But now I know you, your stubbornness and your grief and your terrible cooking, and I'm choosing you anyway, not despite your flaws, but because they're part of who you are, because you're real and broken and trying. That's more than I ever hoped for." He kissed her then, slower and deeper than that first tentative kiss outside the barn, and Evelyn felt something settle into place inside her chest. This was right. Imperfect and complicated and born from crisis, but fundamentally right. A sound from the loft made them separate. Lila's sleepy voice drifted down. "Are you two kissing again? Because I'm very happy about it, but I'm also very hungry and would like breakfast." They laughed, the moment broken but not diminished, and Evelyn moved to start breakfast while Caleb went to work in his shop. The morning unfolded with the rhythm they'd established. Lessons after breakfast, Lila working through increasingly complex mathematics while Evelyn prepared materials for the afternoon's history lesson. The girl was thriving, her hunger for knowledge insatiable, and Evelyn had already begun corresponding with a school in Cheyenne about advanced materials for gifted students. Around mid-morning, they heard horses approaching. Evelyn looked out to see Sheriff Turner and another rider, a woman in an expensive traveling coat, her posture unmistakable even from a distance. Helen Colburn. Evelyn's stomach clenched. They hadn't seen or heard from Lila's grandmother since the hearing. The court-ordered visitation wasn't supposed to begin until summer. What was she doing here? Caleb emerged from his workshop, wiping his hands on his apron, his expression wary. Evelyn sent Lila to her loft with instructions to stay there until called, then went to stand beside Caleb as their visitors dismounted. "Mrs. Colburn," Caleb said stiffly, "this is unexpected." "Mr. Grant?" "Miss Moore." Helen's voice was controlled but not hostile. Up close, Evelyn could see she looked older than at the hearing, as if the intervening weeks had cost her something. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. Sheriff Turner was kind enough to escort me." "Just making sure there's no trouble," Turner said. "Mrs. Colburn asked me to accompany her, and I thought it wise." "What do you want?" Caleb asked bluntly. Helen's composure wavered slightly. "To see my granddaughter. Briefly, if you'll permit it. I'm not here to cause problems or challenge the court's ruling. I need to see her. Please." Caleb looked at Evelyn, who shrugged slightly. They couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable, and the court had granted visitation rights. Better to control the meeting here than have it forced upon them later. "She can come down," Caleb said finally. "But I stay with her the entire time. Those are my terms. I accept them." Evelyn fetched Lila, who descended the ladder with obvious reluctance, staying close to her father's side. Helen stared at the girl with such naked longing that Evelyn felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Whatever else she was, Helen Colburn was a woman who'd lost her daughter and was looking at a living echo of that loss. "Hello, Lila," Helen said softly. "I'm your grandmother Colburn. We met briefly at the hearing." "I remember." Lila's voice was small but not unkind. "You wanted to take me away. I wanted to give you opportunities. I see now that I went about it wrongly. Your father was right. I tried to control Sarah's life, and when she chose differently, I pushed her away. I've regretted that every day since she died. I don't want to make the same mistake with you." "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm lonely." The admission seemed to cost Helen greatly. "Because you're my only connection to the daughter I lost, and I can't bear the thought of never knowing you. Not because I want to take you from your home, but because I hope we might find some way to be part of each other's lives." Lila looked up at Caleb, seeking permission or guidance. He nodded slightly. The girl took a small step forward, still wary but curious. "Mama never talked about you," Lila said. "Papa told me you and Mama didn't agree about things, that you stopped being family before I was born." "That's true, and it was my fault. I valued the wrong things: social position, wealth, control. Your mother valued freedom and love. She was braver than I ever was." Helen's voice shook. "You look so much like her. Same eyes, same determined chin. She used to look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now when she thought I was being unreasonable." "Was she right? Were you being unreasonable?" "Usually, yes." A ghost of a smile crossed Helen's face. "Your mother was quite good at seeing through pretense. I suspect you inherited that trait." "I'm good at lots of things. Miss Evelyn teaches me. I can do multiplication up to 12 times 12, and I know all the capitals of the territories, and I'm reading books about ancient Rome." "That's remarkable. Your mother loved to read too. She could get lost in books for hours." Helen paused, then carefully pulled something from her coat pocket. "I brought you something, if your father permits?" Caleb nodded again, though his posture remained tense. Helen held out a small leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. "This was your mother's journal. She kept it when she was about your age. I thought you might like to read it, to know her through her own words." Lila took the journal reverently, opening it to reveal pages covered in childish handwriting that grew more refined as the entries progressed. She looked up at Helen with something like wonder. "Really? Mama wrote this when she was little like me?" "Yes, she wrote about her dreams, her frustrations with me, her love of horses and storms and stories. I think she'd want you to have it. Thank you. The words were quiet but genuine. Thank you, grandmother. Helen's eyes filled with tears at the name. You're welcome, child. And I want you to know, I won't fight the court's ruling. I won't try to take you from your father, but I hope that perhaps when summer comes, you might consider visiting me in Cheyenne, just for the 2 weeks the judge allowed. I'd like to show you where your mother grew up, tell you stories about her childhood, help you know the part of her history that I represent. Lila looked at Caleb. Papa, would that be okay? The question clearly cost Caleb something, but he answered steadily. If you want to go, I won't stop you. Your grandmother is right. She's part of your history, part of your mother's story. I don't have to like it, but I'll respect it. I'd like to go, Lila said slowly, but only for 2 weeks. And then I come home. This is my home, here with Papa and Miss Evelyn. That doesn't change. I understand. Helen stood, preparing to leave. She looked at Caleb, and some of the aristocratic coldness had melted from her face. Mr. Grant, I misjudged you. I saw a carpenter who'd taken my daughter from her proper place in society, and I couldn't see past my own prejudice to recognize that Sarah chose you because you were what she needed. You gave her happiness I never could. And you're giving my granddaughter something equally precious, freedom to be herself. I'm sorry for trying to take that away. I'm sorry for your loss, Caleb said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. Sarah was remarkable. We both loved her. That's common ground, at least. Helen nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she turned to Evelyn. Miss Moore, I underestimated you as well. I assumed you were an opportunist taking advantage of Mr. Grant's difficult circumstances. I see now that you genuinely care for this family. I hope you'll be happy together. Thank you, Mrs. Colburn. That means more than you might think. After Helen and Sheriff Turner left, the cabin felt strangely quiet. Lila sat by the fire, reading her mother's childhood journal with careful attention, occasionally laughing at something Sarah had written. Caleb returned to his workshop, but through the window, Evelyn saw him standing motionless at his bench, staring at nothing. She found him there an hour later, still motionless, lost in thought. Caleb? He looked up, and she saw tears on his face, the first she'd ever witnessed from him. She gave Lila Sarah's journal, the one I didn't even know existed. All these years I've tried to keep Sarah's memory alive for our daughter with just my stories, my incomplete picture of who she was. And Helen just gave Lila a piece of her mother I could never provide. That doesn't diminish what you've given her. You've given her love and security and a home. Helen gave her a book. It's not just a book. It's Sarah's voice, Sarah's thoughts, Sarah's childhood preserved in her own handwriting. Lila will read that and know her mother in ways I never could have shown her. He wiped his face roughly. I should be grateful. Grateful. But it also reminds me how much I've lost, how much Lila never got to have. Evelyn moved closer, taking his hands in hers. Sarah's death was a tragedy. Nothing changes that. But Caleb, you've spent 8 years keeping her memory sacred by refusing to fully live yourself. Maybe it's time to honor her differently, by being happy, by loving again, by showing Lila that loss doesn't have to define us forever. I don't know if I can. You're already doing it. Every time you smile at Lila's jokes, every time you kiss me good morning, every time you choose to hope instead of grieve, you're doing it. Sarah's memory doesn't require your misery to remain precious. She'd want you to live, Caleb, truly live, not just survive. He pulled her close, holding her with the desperation of a man learning to let go of old pain. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, it's terrifying. But we'll do it together. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the workshop that smelled of wood and varnish and possibility. While outside the snow continued to fall, and inside the cabin Lila read her mother's words, and learned that grief and joy could coexist, that families could be broken and remade, that love had many forms, and all of them mattered. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Peterson arrived with a dress she'd commissioned from the finest seamstress in Pine Hollow. Simple cream silk with lace at the collar, far more beautiful than anything Evelyn had ever owned. Lila had a new dress too, pale blue with ribbons, and she practiced walking down the aisle with such seriousness that both adults had to suppress smiles. Caleb worked late into the nights finishing a special project, a hope chest for Evelyn, cedar-lined and beautifully carved with pine branches and songbirds. When he presented it to her 2 days before the wedding, she couldn't speak for the emotion clogging her throat. "It's traditional," he said, almost shy, "for a groom to give his bride something handmade. I wanted you to have something that was just yours, something beautiful that would last." "It's perfect," she managed. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate, but thank you." Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The cabin glowed with lamplight, and the small decorations they'd made together, pine boughs over the door, candles in the windows. Lila's drawings of snowflakes hung on twine stretched across the rafters. They ate supper together, the three of them, and Evelyn thought about how this was their last evening as not quite a family, how tomorrow everything would be official and binding and real in ways that still made her nervous despite her certainty. After Lila went to bed, Caleb walked Evelyn to her small room, lingering in the doorway. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, trying for levity but unable to quite hide the anxiety beneath. "I'm not changing my mind. Are you?" "No. But I want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. I'm not going to suddenly become easy to live with. I'll still have days when the grief catches me sideways, when I'm distant or difficult. I'll still work too much and talk too little and probably forget important occasions. You deserve someone whole and uncomplicated, and that's not me." "I don't want someone whole and uncomplicated. I want you." She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Caleb, I'm not walking into this blind. I know who you are. The stubborn, grieving, devoted man who works himself to exhaustion for his daughter and has slowly, grudgingly let me into his heavily guarded heart. That's who I'm choosing. That's who I want to spend my life with." "Why?" "I still don't understand why you'd choose this life when you could have so much more. Because this life is mine. Not something handed to me. Not something I fell into by accident, but something I'm actively choosing and building. I spent years in Philadelphia living a life that happened to me, teaching because it was respectable, existing because the alternative was unthinkable. This is the first time I've felt truly alive, truly purposeful. You and Lila didn't rescue me from loneliness. I rescued myself by being brave enough to answer those letters, and then brave enough to stay when everything went wrong. This life is my reward for that courage, and I'm not giving it up." He kissed her then with an intensity that spoke of gratitude and desire and the beginning of love that hadn't quite found words yet. When they parted, his eyes held less fear and more hope than she'd ever seen. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Christmas morning dawned brilliant and cold. Evelyn woke before first light, her stomach fluttering with nerves and anticipation. She dressed carefully in the cream silk gown, pinned her hair up with the ivory combs Mrs. Peterson had lent her, and studied her reflection in the small mirror. She looked different somehow, not just dressed for a wedding, but transformed, confident, chosen, home. The ceremony was scheduled for noon at the small church in Pine Hollow. They arrived early to find the building already filling with townspeople, more than Evelyn had expected, their curiosity or genuine good wishes bringing them out despite the cold. Mrs. Peterson fussed over Lila's ribbons, while Sheriff Turner stood with Caleb near the altar, both men looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes. Then the music started. A simple hymn played on the church's worn piano, and Evelyn walked down the aisle on Mrs. Peterson's arm, her eyes finding Caleb's and holding them. He looked terrified and awed in equal measure, standing rigidly in his wedding suit, and she wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously at how perfectly imperfect this moment was. The minister began the ceremony, his words familiar and strange all at once. Evelyn barely heard them, focused entirely on Caleb's face, watching him struggle with emotion as they repeated their vows. When it came time for him to speak his promises, his voice was rough but steady. "I, Caleb Grant, take you, Evelyn Moore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, respect you, and protect you for all the days of my life. I promise to work beside you in building our family and our home. I promise to try, every single day, to be worthy of the gift you've given me by choosing us." Evelyn's own vows came easier, flowing from certainty rather than obligation. "I, Evelyn Moore, take you, Caleb Grant, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you in joy and in sorrow. I promise to love your daughter as if she were my own. I promise to be patient with your grief, gentle with your healing, and steadfast in my commitment to the life we're building together." The minister pronounced them married, and when Caleb kissed her, the small church erupted in applause. Lila bounced in her seat, clapping wildly, her face radiant with joy. This was what she'd hoped for, what she'd gambled everything on when she'd written those letters. A family, whole and chosen and real. The celebration afterward at Mrs. Peterson's ranch was simple but warm. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing despite the limited space. Evelyn found herself passed from partner to partner. Sheriff Turner, then Mr. Harrison the furniture buyer, then even Judge Morrison, who'd come despite having no obligation to attend. "You did well up there," the judge told her as they danced. "Many would have fled when faced with what you encountered, the deception, the custody battle, the forced engagement. You stayed and made something real from it. That takes character." "Or stubbornness," Evelyn said. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He smiled slightly. "I'll be watching, Miss Moore. Mrs. Grant, I should say. Making sure that marriage stays genuine, that young Lila continues to thrive. But between you and me, I don't think I'll find any problems. You're good for them, and they're good for you." Later, as the sun began to set and guests started heading home, Lila pulled both Evelyn and Caleb aside with the importance of someone about to make an announcement. "I have presents for you," she declared. "I made them myself." She handed them each a carefully folded piece of paper. Evelyn opened hers to find a drawing, 3 figures holding hands beneath a crooked roof, a man, a woman, and a small girl between them. Below it, in Lila's careful script, were the words, "Our family. Papa, Mama Evelyn, and me. Forever." "Mama Evelyn," Evelyn repeated, her voice catching. "Is that okay? I know you're not my real mama, but you feel like one. You teach me and take care of me and love me like I think a mama would. So can I call you that? Just between us?" Evelyn gathered the girl close, holding her tight. "I would be honored, so very honored." Caleb's drawing was similar, but included more detail. The cabin, the workshop, the barn, even the garden Evelyn had begun planning for spring. At the bottom, Lila had written, "Thank you for being brave enough to let us love you again." Caleb stared at those words for a long moment, then pulled his daughter into his arms, his face buried in her hair. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, but his smile was genuine. The first truly unguarded smile Evelyn had seen from him. "I love you, Lila Bug, and I promise to keep trying to be the father you deserve." "You already are, Papa. You just needed help seeing it." They returned home as the stars emerged, the wagon rattling over frozen ground, the 3 of them bundled together under blankets. Lila fell asleep between them, her head on Evelyn's shoulder, snoring softly. Caleb drove with one arm around his family, and Evelyn thought about how strange and wonderful it was that this exact moment, this exact configuration of people, was now her life, her choice, her future. The cabin was dark when they arrived, but Caleb had arranged for someone to light the lamps beforehand, and warm light spilled from the windows. He carried Lila inside and tucked her into the loft, while Evelyn banked the fire and set water to heat for tea. When he came back down, he found her standing by the window, still in her wedding dress, watching snow begin to fall again. "Mrs. Grant," he said, testing the name, "how does it feel?" "Right. Terrifying, but right." She turned to face him. "How about for you?" "The same. I never thought I'd stand in a church and promise myself to someone again. Never thought I'd want to, but standing there with you today, saying those vows, it felt like coming back to life after years of just existing. That's what we're doing, I think. Learning to live again instead of just survive. All 3 of us." He crossed to her, pulling her close. "I don't know how to do this yet. How to be a husband again. How to share my life and my space and my heart. But I want to learn. Will you be patient with me while I figure it out?" "I'll be patient if you'll be patient with me. I've never been a wife or a mother before. I'll make mistakes, misunderstand what you need, probably overstep in my efforts to help. We'll stumble through this together." "Together," he repeated, as if the word was foreign but becoming familiar. I like the sound of that. They stood by the fire, holding each other while the snow fell and the cabin creaked in the wind, and somewhere above them Lila dreamed of the family she'd wished into existence through sheer force of will and carefully forged letters. Outside, the world was cold and dark. Inside, three people who'd each been broken in their own ways were learning how to fit together, how to build something lasting from fragments of loneliness and hope. The weeks after the wedding settled into a new rhythm. Evelyn moved her few belongings into the main bedroom, the space feeling strange and intimate all at once. Caleb was careful with her at first, almost formal, as if he'd forgotten how to share his life with another adult. But slowly, gradually, they learned each other's patterns and preferences. She discovered he liked his coffee black and strong, that he worked best in silence, that he had nightmares sometimes and woke gasping Sarah's name. He learned that she read before bed every night, that she hummed while cooking, that she needed solitude occasionally to process her thoughts. They had their first argument 3 weeks into the marriage, something insignificant about how to discipline Lila, escalating into deeper issues about authority and respect, and whose voice mattered more in parenting decisions. Evelyn stormed out to the barn, furious and hurt, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. An hour later, Caleb found her there, sitting in the hay with her arms wrapped around her knees. "I'm not good at this," he said without preamble, "at sharing decisions, at compromising. I've been alone so long that having someone question my judgment feels like an attack, even when I know it isn't. I'm not trying to undermine you, I'm trying to be a partner. I know, and I'm trying to let you, but Sarah and we had years to learn how to work together. You and I have had weeks. It's going to take time. I don't want to fight with you, Caleb. I don't want to fight with you either, but we probably will, sometimes. That's what people do when they care enough to disagree." He sat down beside her, close but not touching. "Can we agree to keep trying? To argue when we need to, apologize when we're wrong, and not let anger fester?" "We can agree to that." They went back to the cabin together, and that night, lying in the darkness, Caleb told her stories about Sarah, how they'd met, what she'd loved, how she'd died. It hurt to hear, but Evelyn listened, understanding that these stories were a gift, a way of including her in the history that had shaped him. "I'm not trying to replace her," Evelyn said when he finished. "I couldn't even if I wanted to, but I hope there's room in your heart for both of us, for the memory of who she was and the reality of who I am." "There is," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "There has to be, because I'm falling in love with you, Evelyn. Not the same way I loved Sarah, but something different, something built on choice and respect and partnership. It feels disloyal somehow, but also right. Is that possible?" "I think it's not only possible, but necessary. You can honor Sarah's memory while building a new life. Those things aren't contradictory." "I hope you're right." Spring arrived slowly, melting snow revealing the brown earth beneath. Evelyn planted the garden she'd been planning, with Lila's eager help. They grew vegetables and herbs, and Lila insisted on a section just for flowers because Mama liked flowers, and Mama Evelyn should too. The name had stuck. In private, Lila called Evelyn Mama, and each time she did, Evelyn felt something settle deeper in her chest. This child was hers now, not by blood, but by choice, and daily commitment and fierce protective love. In May, Helen Colburn's carriage arrived to collect Lila for the court-mandated 2-week visit. The goodbye was hard, Lila crying despite her excitement about the trip, Caleb rigid with the effort of not forbidding her to go. But they'd promised, and so they watched her drive away, then returned to a cabin that felt too quiet, too empty. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked, standing in the middle of the room, as if he'd forgotten its purpose. "We trust her. We trust that we've given her enough love and security that 2 weeks away won't undo it. And we use this time to be just us, to remember that we're not just parents, but partners building a marriage." Those 2 weeks were strange and precious. They worked together in companionable silence, took evening walks without having to match a child's shorter stride, talked late into the night about dreams and fears and the future they were building. Caleb opened up more without Lila there, shared things he'd kept hidden, and Evelyn felt herself falling deeper in love with this complicated, wounded, increasingly whole man. When Lila returned, she was full of stories about Cheyenne, the big house, the fancy dinners, the museum Helen had taken her to. But she was also exhausted and clingy, needing reassurance that home was still home, that her parents were still hers. Grandmother was kind, she told them that first night back. She tried very hard to make me happy, but it wasn't home. This is home. You are home. I'm glad I went, glad I know her now, but I'm gladder to be back. We're glad too, Caleb said, and Evelyn heard the relief in his voice. He'd been terrified that Lila would prefer Cheyenne's advantages to their simple life. Her choosing them again, with full knowledge of the alternative, meant everything. Summer passed into autumn, and with it came small milestones. Lila turned 9, celebrated with a party that included children from town, the first friends her age she'd ever had. Caleb's furniture business grew, his reputation spreading, more orders than he could fill alone. Evelyn's teaching expanded too. 3 other families in the area asked if she'd tutor their children, and twice a week, the cabin became a makeshift schoolhouse filled with young minds hungry for knowledge. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Evelyn had first stepped off that train in Pine Hollow, she woke to find Caleb already awake, watching her in the early light. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking about how different my life is from a year ago. How different I am." He traced her cheekbone with his thumb. "A year ago, I was barely surviving. Now I'm living, really living, because you were brave enough to answer those letters, stay when you should have left, and build this life with us. We built it together, all 3 of us." "True, but you were the catalyst, the one who forced change when we'd have stayed frozen in grief and isolation." He paused, then added softly, "I love you, Evelyn Grant. I should say it more often. I love you for your strength and your patience and your willingness to love us broken pieces." "I love you too," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being, broken pieces and all. They made love slowly, tenderly, and Evelyn thought about how she'd traveled 2,000 miles expecting one future and found something entirely different, something harder and stranger and more real than anything she'd imagined. She'd come seeking a home and found a family. She'd come expecting to be needed and discovered she was wanted. Most importantly, she'd learned that families didn't have to be built from blood or tradition. They could be built from choice and commitment and the daily work of loving people who sometimes made that work difficult. That evening, they gathered for supper as usual. But before they ate, Lila presented them with something she'd been working on, a story written in her careful script about a girl brave enough to write a letter and a woman brave enough to answer it. "It's for you, Mama Evelyn," Lila said, handing over the carefully bound pages. "The story of how you became my mother, how we became a family." Evelyn read it aloud while Caleb listened, his hand covering hers on the table. The story was simple but true, capturing the fear and hope and desperate gamble that had brought them together. When she finished, her voice was thick with emotion. "It's perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect. Will you keep it forever, so we always remember how we started?" "I'll keep it forever," Evelyn promised. "And someday, when you're grown with children of your own, you can tell them this story, about how your father was brave enough to let love in again, about how a child's courage brought 3 lonely people together, about how families aren't always born, sometimes they're chosen." After Lila went to bed, Evelyn found Caleb in the workshop, standing before a partially finished piece, a dining table, larger than the one they had, meant to seat 6 instead of 3. "Planning for the future?" she asked. "Hoping for it, at least. Thought maybe someday we'd need more room, for guests, or other reasons." He glanced at her, suddenly shy. "If you wanted, more children, I mean. I know we haven't discussed it, and I'd understand if you didn't—" "I'd want that," Evelyn interrupted softly. "Not right away, perhaps. But someday. Brothers or sisters for Lila. More love in this house that's already so full of it." He pulled her close, and they stood together in the wood-scented workshop, while outside the stars emerged and inside the cabin their daughter slept safely in her loft, dreaming of the family she'd written into existence through nothing more than hope and ink and impossible courage. Above the workbench, tacked to the wall where Caleb could see it every day, hung Lila's drawing, 3 figures holding hands beneath a crooked roof. Not perfect, but chosen. Not blood, but family. Not the life any of them had planned, but the life they'd built together through trial and error and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. And in the cabin, tucked into Evelyn's hope chest beside her wedding dress and her mother's cameo, rested those original letters, the ones that had started everything. Lies that had become truth. Deception that had led to love. Words that had carried a lonely teacher across a continent to find, in the unlikeliest of places, exactly where she belonged. Home wasn't a place she'd come to. It was a family she'd chosen, and who had chosen her in return. And that, Evelyn thought as she stood in her husband's arms, surrounded by wood shavings and lamplight and the quiet sounds of their sleeping daughter, that was the truest kind of home there was.